one of the things he points out is the fossil record. What do we see in the fossil record? Stasis and extinction, neither of which help evolution at all.
When you tell one lie, the next you have to tell another lie to cover it up. And somebody approaches you on that, you got to tell another lie. It's like lies snowball, and eventually your whole structure becomes too unstable to manage, and things just fall apart. But that hasn't seemed to have happened with the evolutionary institution and people approaching things that way. And I'm wondering why it hasn't happened yet. So you are Ian Juby, I was going to make sure I had like a list of your accomplishments and all the things that go underneath your name.
I don't have a lot there, so.
Well, I mean, at least it sounds like you have kind of an interesting past or occupation or hobbies. Like you've done some archaeology, you've done...
Yeah, a lot of hobbies. Yeah.
Is that basically the extent of it?
Yeah.
It's just like you're a maverick hobbyist?
Yeah, except I get paid for the hobbies sometimes. So what does that make you? I don't know.
A freelancer? I don't know.
Yeah, freelance. Oh, I like that. I like that. I was thinking professional, but freelancer. I like that better, yes.
So what all have you, I mean, can you kind of give me at least a little bit more of some threshold or kind of try to understand the range of your hobbies and what you're interested in?
Yeah, so I started off as a robotics engineer. That's what I actually went to school for.
No way.
And when after I graduated from college, I was backslidden at the time. I became a born again Christian when I was 13, but backslid a few years after that, and so it was about 8 years. I was just backslid, just destroyed my life really.
Okay.
And then, so after I graduated college, which was the course I wanted to take, and had a blast. It was a lot of fun. But my life just took a dive, and I returned back to the Lord at that point, and even wound up down at Last Days Ministries in Texas. Keith Green and Melody Green, they started that ministry.
Oh, okay.
And so I wound up down there, and they called it the Discipleship Training School. They had just joined in with Youth with a Mission, YWAM.
So this was probably one of the earlier iterations of it. Because, I mean, I went to a similar kind of like school focused very much on like, on missionary. I mean, I went to a school called Fire School of Ministry in North Carolina, which is like connected to the Brownsville movement, all that.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Okay. Interesting.
I mean, all of these are super sort of like, I mean, I guess if you know them, then you know them. And like, I mean, I'm familiar with YWAM.
Right.
At least, I mean, yeah, because that's continued on. Fire, I guess, is a little bit more kind of under the radar, but I mean, I feel like it's similar kind of idea of, well, I mean, and it maybe anyways.
Probably was, because I mean, they had what they called their intensive Christian training school at Last Days Ministries, and that was based on Lauren Cunningham's DTS, the Discipleship Training School. So, I mean, they all kind of go off the same idea of, basically the idea is that it takes 6 months to change behavior or thinking on average and whatnot. So they usually base
so there is a method to the madness of
yeah, exactly. So they kind of sort of focus on that 6 month time span, and it was for YWAM, it was basically 5 months and a month of outreach.
Okay.
5 months of training. And you know what? I have never, not before nor since, I have never seen a program that so radically changed so many people in such a short amount of time. Never. Not before or since. It was pretty...
It seems like it's certainly like an intense experience for people to go through it.
Yep, it was. Yeah.
So, but that was, I mean, when I think about my experience at the school I went to, it's more of a complicated thing for me to kind of unpack as far as like there was some really inspiring, really exciting moments in that experience. This was like a 3-year kind of Bible school, but there was also a lot of, I mean, that was kind of where I started asking a lot of I guess probably the first moments in my life where I really started asking the deep questions or really feeling willing to ask them, because I thought, okay, like up to that point, like well, eventually I'll get to answer or ask that question because I'll be at school, and then I'll be able to get all the answers there. And I didn't have the experience I was looking for in my
right. Yeah, and I lost my train of thought.
But I mean,
see if I'd catch the caboose.
Part of it even was like I ended up getting stumbled up on this like creation evolution debate.
Yes, and when I was at Last Days, it was a huge base. I mean, there was 300 some people living there, full cafeteria. They had a full television recording studio, everything, and they brought in this guy. And because I basically grew up working in a summer science camp in Eastern Ontario. I started teaching when I was 16, and at that time, that science camp was the only one of its kind we knew of in the world. Now, about 5-6 years after they started it, they started springing up all over the world. And by the time, 10 years down the road, we had heard of others in, Russia and all over the place.
Right.
So the concept kind of spread. So everyone kind of looked to me as like the science guy, right?
Right.
So, and I was interested
right.
in that. Anything science and tech, I was into that. I love it. So when I was at Last Days, they brought in this guy by the name of Dr. Carl Baugh, and he did a 3.5-hour lecture off the top of his head, with him and a whiteboard, and they recorded it all, made a video series, and it was just riveting stuff. And I had sort of, everybody thought I knew what I was talking about with creation and evolution. Really, I didn't, especially in hindsight. It's like I knew nothing.
But you at least knew enough to teach something that people were interested in.
Yeah, I suppose the expression "you know enough to be dangerous." That kind of idea. Yeah. So this guy came in and did this 3.5-hour lecture, that, and it was riveting stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, he had done a whole pile of firsthand research in the Paluxy River with fossil human and fossil dinosaur tracks found together in the riverbed as well. And I meant to post to Facebook that I was on your podcast. Oh, well. So he, I wrote a letter because back then, email didn't exist.
Right.
So I wrote him a letter at the museum, and just before we left for our outreach, which we wound up going to Russia. We were in Russia 2 weeks after the wall came down, I think it was. We even beat the Mormons in there. I mean, it was it was amazing, actually. Wow. It was quite stunning. So we were down in Tuapse, and now everybody knows where Sochi is now because of the Olympics, right? So we were down in Tuapse, Sochi on the Black Sea, that region. We were there for 5 weeks thereabouts.
You were doing some archaeology stuff there? Or?
No, that was the outreach portion.
For
so
your
missions
YWAM
training.
Okay.
Basically, we were.
Sorry. I'm jumping ahead a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. So just before we left, I wrote this letter just saying, I'm going to be back in, a month. I'd like to come volunteer at your museum for a while if possible. And so when I got back, I had a really nice letter and phone calls from him, actually, because he called the base because he had been there before.
Yeah.
And they were running their first, what did they call it? His wife, Martha, was the one who arranged it, and it was a huge success. It was a creation fair, I think is what he called it. And so basically they had speakers, they had people bring displays and exhibits. They had something like 5,500 people come through on that weekend alone. It was huge. And so that was coming up, and he's like, yeah, we could use your help volunteering for this. And it was cool because I was there for, I think, 3 weeks.
Wow.
And so you got literally scientists and engineers from all over the world coming here.
You were still, wait, how old were you at this time? This was
20.
Okay.
Something
so
like that.
This was right at the time where you're like probably wanting to start really jumping into these questions. And suddenly you're surrounded by these...
I was still in repair mode at that point.
Could you, Evan, just turn off the air? I don't want to have that just for sound. But that sounds...
because these things will probably pick it up.
A little bit, yeah.
Right.
But, okay, so that must have been an awesome experience.
Yeah, it was, you just sit there and just soak up information, because these people are coming from all over the world.
Wow.
And it was a blast. Now, I was still very much in repair mode because I had damaged myself so much mentally, emotionally, stuff like in particular. So I was still very much in repair mode and heal mode. But it was very much life changing. And then wound up coming back to Canada, and the owners of the science camp, Wayne and Carol, had been doing contract work with the separate school board here in Ontario, in Ottawa Valley, and so they were building this brand new high school, and they said basically, they could really use your help. They spent, I don't know, a couple $1 million on new high tech equipment for the tech wing, and could you stick around for a couple of weeks to help set everything up and teach the teachers how to use the equipment, figure it out, all that, because of my robotics background. Right, they had a lot of robotic industrial machines, welders, and I mean, it was right up my alley. It was glorious. It was awesome. All this, the latest in tech. It was cool. And so I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? Because I'm just going to go back to Texas, right? That was the plan. I just go back to Last Days and volunteer for 4 or 5 months. And so at the end of 2 weeks, I'm there, and teacher comes out of the back room in the tech wing and says, "Congratulations." I said, "Thanks. For what?" Says, "You got the job." What job? What are you talking about?
Right.
And a few minutes later, the department head comes in. He says, "Congratulations." "Thanks. For what?" "You got the job." "What job? What are you talking about?"
Right.
I wasn't applying for a job. And so basically they gave me a permanent job, and I was just baffled. I'm going home and I'm praying about this, going like, "Lord, what am I supposed to do?" I was planning on going back to Texas. This was not my intention. And prayed about it for days and just could not get an answer. And I'm like, well, all right, I have an open door before me. I'll take it. If I'm not supposed to take it, stop me. Pretty simple. The Lord knows my heart. He knows I'm not walking in rebellion. I'm trying to follow his lead. And it was an awesome job that prepared me for what I was going to do. I learned so much. I wound up working there 10 years.
Right.
But that first year, this one young guy going to the school asked, he was supposed to do a class project, and he asked, because he knew of my interest in creation and evolution, he asked his teacher if he could bring me in as a guest speaker to work on his project with him.
Right.
And so we did, and that was the first creation evolution talk I ever gave in the public school, was that, and it just kept happening because teachers and students kept asking. And then so I started developing what I would speak on. It taught me how to teach it, basically, And out of that, I started developing the Creation Museum that I built from scratch, which was the first one in the country that I know of.
You actually, you currently still run this, like this is a
yes,
the whole museum?
Yeah, no, it's kind of shifted mode in the past 7 years, because about 8 years now. About 8 years ago, I started producing on YouTube. This was when YouTube was still pretty new, I started producing a TV, basically a TV show. It was a show on YouTube called Genesis Week, and it was just a weekly show. And but I was on the road at the time with my museum, so I was traveling all over North America with this thing. And so I mean, I literally set up my green screen, hang it from the ceiling in the basement of the pastor's house I'm staying at in Nova Scotia, and film it, and edit and upload it. And so one of the pastors in Newfoundland, Dino Young, if you're listening.
I think I actually knew that guy. Or met him before.
Actually, you probably have. You probably have. So he was like, "Oh, I think you should make that for TV. You should put it on Miracle Channel." And originally, when I made the show, I did have Miracle Channel in mind. In fact, I made a pilot show.
That's like a Christian TV station. Okay.
Yeah. So that was because when Miracle Channel first started in Canada, it was actually illegal to have a Christian TV station in Canada.
Okay, so
hence
this
the
is
name Miracle Channel. So
so it's not it's specifically Christian, but it's about miracles and miraculous things.
well, yeah, but except that was the miracle part because it was the first Christian television station in Canada.
So they managed to get around the law on it, or get it changed.
They basically yes.
Okay.
They convinced the CRTC to allow it. Frankly, the arguments against it were bogus anyway, because it's like, well, nobody's telling the Muslims they can't have a TV station.
Yeah.
Why?
Right. Well, it points to this kind of core animosity between the institution and, well, I don't know. There's certainly, I mean, growing up in the similar circles as I think you're probably still involved in, like there was always this sense that like that the government was sort of out to get us and like stop Christianity from spreading, which I kind of understand to some extent. I don't know. I'm still kind of processing how much that seems to really be the case, but there's definitely I don't know.
It is a tough one, and especially back then too. So this would have been, wow. Well, this is going back a lot because the guy that brought me to the Lord, Beaver, he actually we all call him Beaver. That's just his nickname. He actually had several Christian radio programs that he had run previously in the 80s, and that was the point. Then was you couldn't have a Christian radio station. CRTC is like, nope. If you're allowed to have a Christian radio station or a Christian TV station, then the Muslims can have a Muslim TV station or a Muslim radio station. More power to them.
Yeah, sure.
It's
like we're already. It's like it's not like you're going to stop the spread of values. like there's other religions that the religions just don't necessarily have names, but there's sort of a religious moral direction on that like any other TVs or any other stories are sort of promoting. So it's like you're preventing religious thinking from being going on TV.
Yeah. So and it was that was the argumentation.
Right.
And as you noted, it's a bogus argument.
Yeah.
It just doesn't stack up. So eventually they caved and they allowed Miracle Channel to start up. The Christian radio station in Ottawa also sprung up. The radio station sprung up at that time as well. I forget the name of that station right now. That's horrible. Anyway, so where was I going with that? Yes, okay, Miracle Channel. So I actually talked with Miracle Channel and showed them my pilot show, which was filmed on the banks of the Paluxy River during one of the, they have public excavations there, the Creation Evidence Museum, Dr. Carl Baugh. They have public excavations. You can go and participate in excavating dinosaur tracks, hopefully fossil human footprints. Cool. And they do uncover them still. It's been a few years of a dry spell now, but there are so many dinosaur tracks there too. Just in that 1 mile stretch of river, I added it up, and it was well over 1,000 dinosaur tracks and over 100 human fossil footprints in that 1 mile stretch.
Doesn't that would be kind of a key thing to point to, I guess, for like the debate between evolution and creation, or at least like 6-day creation. Maybe we should start talking that way already.
Yeah,
differentiate a little bit, but because from an evolutionary perspective, dinosaurs, or like maybe we also want to distinguish between macro and microevolution. I don't know. You did this at the beginning of your series too, but like in general, when people talk about evolution, they're thinking about millions of years, and they're thinking about consciousness eventually inhabiting, or like life and then consciousness sort of spontaneously emerging. But so we could just settle on those terms, that evolution is a reference to that, and creation is a reference to 6 days.
Yes.
But
yes.
Sure. So within the evolutionary model, there wouldn't be dinosaurs and humans on the Earth at the same time.
Correct. And there's been multiple evolutionary scholars who have said that in print.
Right.
That if you find fossil humans and fossil dinosaurs together, that completely disqualifies the theory of evolution and affirms the biblical young Earth creation model, specifically the young Earth creation model, because there are people who believe God used evolution and billions of years to.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so.
to get the elephant out of in the room right early. I mean, I find that compelling. Like I find it seems to me the case. I obviously I still appreciate and practice Christianity, but it seems that the evidence for evolution seems compelling and interesting to me.
Okay.
So like,
so which evidence?
I mean, partly just the theory itself. Like there's a. We're jumping into this already. I mean, part of what's gonna trip us up here is that I'm not. I mean, it's interesting to me that you've actually done some on the ground, like actually done the science. Whereas most people, when they try to have this conversation, you're trying to sort of dip your hands into some pretty deep vats of information and conversations about very technical stuff, and like. I can't get that deep into that, but I don't want to use that as an excuse. But I'm excited that I could have you here, actually having had some hands-on interaction with this stuff. But I mean, it's funny. The first time I actually started to learn about evolution and like understand it from a non-Christian bias, because obviously it's always biased. You're always talking about a theory from a particular perspective. But the first time I heard it from a sort of evolutionary science biased perspective was when I read The Selfish Gene.
Oh, yes.
Right. Which when I read that, I mean, I guess I had kind of been a little bit more open to potentially evolution as a means of God sort of creating existence and humans since kind of having these conversations in college and watching debates between like Ken Hovind and Hugh Ross and watching, what's his face? The Ken Ham, I think that's him, and then Bill Nye.
Yep.
Yeah. So those were some key moments to kind of look to, and like
a lot of people saw that Nye Ham debate.
Yeah,
it was like something like 5 million people watching live.
Which I mean, it's interesting because I feel like that kind of somewhat speaks to the moment we were in at that time, because that debate was a little hotter than it is now. To some extent, I feel sort of a momentum towards, and maybe it's just that there's sort of a community bias or let's see, what do you say, a information bias, where you like kind of look for the things that are from confirmation bias.
Yeah, confirmation bias, right.
Just like from the communities I'm surrounding myself with, it seems that Christians are going this way because the Christians that I'm interacting with are going this way.
Yep.
But it feels like that's where a lot of Christians are kind of becoming less jumpy about the idea of evolution and an old Earth and old universe.
Right.
So I mean, you asked me what evidence, and partly, I mean, the only really key evidence that kind of tipped me over the edge to suddenly just being like, okay, I just certainly believe it in an old universe, was when Hugh Ross talked about the stars, talked about the distance of the stars, right? Right, which that kind of was like, okay, that just makes sense to me.
Right.
I'm not even sure with Hugh Ross's his view is, he thinks maybe, I think he even makes his model is like multiple creation events, different times historically.
I believe so.
Which is kind of a weird one.
and to be honest, I've kind of forgotten exactly what it is, but I believe that's correct.
Which is,
which is already, as you say, very different.
But I mean, it makes sense of sort of the like potentially millions, billions of years that he feels convinced of based on the astronomy.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the more common questions.
Right.
What about distant starlight in a young universe? And there's actually multiple responses to that, including that is actually a self-defeating argument, because and here's why: the energy that's spread throughout the universe, it has to get from one end of the universe to the other.
Right.
It can't travel faster than the speed of light.
Right.
But the distance or the time required for that energy to evenly disperse is greater than the alleged age of the universe. So they've got the same starlight problem as well.
Wait, walk me through that one more time. So the potential distance of throw some numbers into this equation, trying to make sense of it. So like let's say the furthest one is like 20 million light years away, which that's probably totally off.
Yeah, it'd be probably like 20 billion or something like that.
Sure. Okay.
So basically,
I mean, you could probably look this up, Evan.
What's it exactly again?
Well, the
Looking for the furthest star. Is that probably the information we're looking for?
No, because it'd be more from one end of the universe to the other.
Well,
so it'd be like the diameter of the known universe.
Okay.
Basically.
But if you're going one end to the other, then I don't think you need the diameter. You need the radius, or at least to the center or
sure,
to the Earth.
Except the energy is evenly dispersed. So
evenly dispersed? What do you mean?
Yes. So evenly distributed. Let's put it that way. So energy has to get from one end of the universe to the other. It has to all spread out evenly. And so 93 billion light years.
Okay, 93 billion. So 20 million was way off, obviously.
Yeah. So, I'd have to go back over the numbers. It's been a long time since I looked at these numbers.
But just as far as like a simple sort of equation.
Yeah, and their answer to that is actually the exact same answer that us young Earth creationists would give, and that is that time is a variable.
It's relative.
Yeah, exactly. It's relative. So clocks at the top of mountains run faster than clocks at sea level because gravity affects time.
Right.
So when you're out in the middle of the universe or out at some distant star where it's out in a part of the universe where there's very little matter, very little gravity, time is extremely fast. So you can have a star that is billions of years old, even though here on Earth, it's only been a few thousand years. Because time is different there than here. What's that movie? Interstellar,
yeah.
which I never did finish.
Okay, it's a good movie.
But yeah, it's that kind of principle, right? So,
I mean, I can't obviously, I can't understand Einsteinian time like relativity theory very well. It's super
complicated.
But I don't know. I'm not really sure what to do with that. I mean, you're saying so that it would be so drastic that that time would literally, so experientially from that star sort of, if you lived on that star,
yes,
it would have been billions of years, but here it hasn't been billions of years.
Correct. There, relative to Earth, it's billions of years because the time is traveling it's a different time scale than here, and it is difficult to wrap your head around. I agree.
I obviously can't argue with that because I can't I can't engage the understanding very well, but
it's a common question.
Yeah,
it's one of the more common ones. Another common question is where's all the human fossils, and which again is perfectly
well. And I mean the creation scientist like books I read in high school, like I was. I was homeschooled, so my mom went out of her way to try to find Christian Science books.
Yep.
And so they talked about even how there was, they didn't talk about the specific guy, but I did some Googling earlier today. If you want to try and pull this up, Evan, there's a guy named Charles, it's not Charles Darwin, it throws me off because it's Charles Dawkins. No, Charles
Lyell?
No, okay, that's a different guy too. But
okay.
This guy was the one who basically built a museum and sort of planted a whole bunch of fake fossils to try to like show off that evolution was real, And this was one of the guys that sort of a lot of...
His name, Charles?
It's Charles something, but just look up fake ape. I think it's called the Stilton Man or something like that.
Yeah, the
Piltdown Man, that's it, yeah.
Yeah.
And the name is Charles Dawson.
Charles
yeah.
Dawson?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't remember that name either.
Yeah. But anyway, apparently he had a whole bunch of these. He basically just put a whole bunch of different bones together.
Right.
And that was kind of the key figure that a lot of young Earth creationists pointed to in some of the, not him particularly, but they said they kind of made these kind of sweeping claims that in general, all these bones that were like supposedly half ape, half man, or like transitional forms were like just bogus, just made up. So
right.
I'm interested to hear kind of, it sounds like most of these arguments you've done a deeper dive than a lot of people that I know.
Yeah, well, and I almost never bring up Piltdown Man. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I do bring it up, I bring it up to kind of put away the argument of consensus science, because the consensus was this is powerful proof of evolution
Right.
at the time. And it was consensus for like 50 years or something.
Yeah.
Some ridiculous number. So consensus science, but that's a completely different argument. I almost never refer to Piltdown Man because it's just, okay, it was
Right,
a,
yeah, it's
it
just
was
a
a
silly.
fake.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well.
But what is? I mean, what are some of the key? I mean, maybe we can jump back to the fossils of like footprints of men and dinosaurs at the same time.
Yep.
Maybe we should go back to that in a second. But as far as like the sort of supposed fossil record of
Yep.
different. I don't know. We always. I mean, you talked about it in your lectures that there's like a this picture of the
Yep.
evolutionary skeletons and stuff like that. The only
Yep.
place apparently you see that is in textbooks.
The Ascent of Man. Yep. And it is. And even the evolutionists have said that.
Okay.
So even evolutionary scholars have discounted that chart and said flat out, it doesn't exist. In fact, if you look at it,
So why would they make that claim as far as from an evolutionary perspective?
it's a popular science thing.
Right.
So it's not a.
It's just that it's not a clear linear like these guys to these guys. 'Cause, I mean, we read
Right.
Yuval Harari's *Sapiens* last year, and he talks about how like there's all over the world you look at different like there was apparently before we kind of distilled down to just Homo sapiens, there was a large population of Neanderthals, and they're kind of eventually. It seems like modern Homo sapiens have like a certain amount of Neanderthal DNA because they interbreeded for a while.
Right. And which tells you right off the bat, by very definition of the species, they were human. If you
Right.
can breed and have fertile offspring, you are the same species.
Yeah.
So obviously they bred and had offspring. There's really nothing about Neanderthals that is not human. Let's put it that way. But other common fossils like Lucy, the most well known one,
Yeah. Okay.
by far and away the most famous. Well, when they talk about that fossil, you'll notice they focus heavily on the knee. And I did make a mistake on this in my original Complete Creation series. In fact, a lot of creationists made the same mistake years ago, but I have to lay the blame for this at the feet of Don Johansen, the guy who discovered Lucy and popularized her. Because whenever he talks about the Lucy skeleton and talks about Lucy's knee, he's not referring to that knee joint that was found with the skeleton.
Okay.
He's referring to a knee that was found 2 kilometers away and about 200 feet, or I think it was about 60 meters deeper.
Okay. Wow.
Under, stratigraphically speaking. Now, he compared the two knees, and he might be right. They may be the same, very similar knees. But if you ever watch the Nova PBS special, they got Owen Lovejoy on there, who is an anatomist. And he says right on there, he says, when Don brought the Hadar knee over to my house, he laid it out on the living room floor, and I knew instantly that was a human knee. I totally agree with him.
Right.
Totally agree. So what they've done is they've taken bones which were scattered over a pretty big area. I mean, we only see these nice, pretty pictures of the skeleton, but I mean, those bones were scattered all over the place,
Right.
over a pretty large area. And so what they've done is they've got 8 bones in there. They've got human bones. They've mixed them all together and basically made a, there's a word for it.
Chimera or
Thank you. That's the word. That's the word. That's exactly the word. You were reading my mind again. Stop that. What else are you reading in there? Yes, a chimera. So they made, literally, it is a half ape, half human. And in fact, what I'll be talking about...
So this is supposedly the same kind of deal as whatever Charles Dawson was doing?
except what Dawson did was deliberate.
Right. Okay. This is more like they were just trying to do it and they made some mistakes.
This is just bias. They go on the assumption that there was no humans at that time because humans had not yet evolved. That's the foundation of their belief, their research, their study. So of course it has to belong to Lucy. It can't be a human knee, even though
this is
I just said it was.
Where can we find? Is there anything Evan can kind of look up to find the people that are talking about this who have sort of proved that it's an ape bone, not a human bone?
No. I was actually, well, except of course you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth, Owen Lovejoy himself and Don Johansson, because they used that argument to say that Lucy walked upright.
Walked upright?
Yes.
Okay.
Walked upright. Yes. My accent is getting.
Okay.
So now here's the catch. Every single one, and I didn't notice this until Chris Roop and John, I've forgotten his name. He's a geneticist.
Okay.
This is horrible. They just came up with an excellent book recently. Bones, not Bones of Contention, Contested Bones.
Okay. Interesting. That would probably be a good book to read to get deeper into this.
John Sanford, that was
okay.
it. That's horrible. I forgot his name.
And this guy is coming at it from a creationist perspective or a old evolution?
But the way they did this, the way they addressed it in the book, which was exceptionally well written and well researched, they pointed out some things, for instance, that, I've read up on this for decades, literally. And it just all went completely over my head. I never even saw it until they pointed it out. Every single one of the major evolutionary researchers over in Africa, when they were digging up all these bones of our alleged half ape, half human ancestors, every single one of them, and it's usually right there in the abstract of the paper, they found bones of humans at every single one of those sites, and they all reported it. I never even saw that before. And so one of the most common questions you will get, or we get as creationists, is where's all the human bones? And it's a good question. Well, there's one. How many of those bones, those human bones that they called human, how many of those we never heard about? They don't talk about them.
Well, are they categorically saying human as in like sapiens or like transitional forms of sapiens?
The moment they put that homo in front of it, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, whatever, you're basically saying it's human.
Right,
so it's the class of Homo.
Right.
And
Well, what's the supposed, like within the evolutionary model, the oldest common ancestor between humans and apes is, what's it called again? Something like
that would be arguable. I think that would depend on who you asked.
I think there's a pretty common one that I've heard. I'm just trying to see it. So what do we see here? Apes, monkeys. Like our closest ones now are supposedly like silverbacks, apes, bonobos.
The chimpanzee is pretty much the one they.
Yeah, chimps. To. Yeah, sorry, I skipped chimps.
Typically. Closest gas station, yeah.
Closest gas station between humans and apes. Okay, ever since researchers sequenced the chimp genome in 2005, they've known that humans share about 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees, making them our closest living relatives. Okay. I mean, as far as closest currently existing.
That's a patently false statement, but hey, go with it.
So unpack that for me. So why?
So chimpanzee genome, okay, so the DNA is made up of, base pairs.
Right.
The ACTG.
Okay.
Yeah. The chimpanzee genome is about 12% longer than the human DNA. Okay. So how can they be 99% identical? You got a serious math problem there.
Is longer than the human. So it's much longer.
Well, I mean, wouldn't the same patterns just be repeating multiple more times?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how DNA structure works that well. So if it's 12% longer, it can't be 99% the same. Like, because isn't there a lot of repetition in genetic, like,
yes and no
information?
But what they're saying is that they're 99% identical. It can't be because they're 12% different.
Well, they're 12% different in size, but
yes,
couldn't you have the same repetitions within that additional?
Basically, no. What they're if you take a look at it. For instance, they'll compare specific gene sets between chimp and human, or specific chromosomes. Sorry, the catch is they'll have a gene here in the chimp genome and in a completely different spot in the human genome, and they will how can I put this? Transpose them. if you actually look at a map where you see the connections between them, they are absolutely all over the place.
Okay.
So the figure most commonly cited is about 96%.
Okay. That's what I just
similar.
saw in another article he just brought up there.
Yeah, typically it's 96% is what they say.
Does that make sense of the 12% difference then? Potentially? No.
And how they got to that, it was a very archaic test, and the number just kind of stuck. And it's still, and again, this is a popular science reference. Right. It's not, it's just simple.
It's just pop science,
simple,
okay.
And simple math. You can't have 99% identical.
Where's do you know where or maybe even how to find the 12% difference in length that you're talking about?
Yeah, it was, if you take a look, boy, it's been a couple of years since I looked this up, because the genomes were both made public.
Okay.
And so you can actually see a base pair count. And because they have the DNA length. Now, the other catch that Dr. Sanford that we mentioned a moment ago, his expertise is genetics. He's a geneticist, right? Him and several others have pointed out the chimpanzee genome. To get that genome, they used the human DNA as a scaffold, so to say. They went on the assumption that humans and chimpanzees are most similar genetically. So therefore, because you can only isolate chunks of the DNA at a time. Mm-hmm. And so what they did was they then took the chimpanzee genome, assumed it was very similar to human DNA, and built it and strung it end to end using the human DNA as a pattern. So there's a bias built in that way.
Okay.
The other problem they discovered afterwards is that it's near impossible to keep human DNA samples out of all this because you're running it through PCR, which everybody's heard about now.
Yeah.
Because of the whole COVID thing and polymerase chain reaction. It's a method of amplifying DNA.
Okay.
Is what it is.
It's like you're going to have your own DNA in there.
Yeah.
Because I've heard claims, even people say stuff like that humans share like really, really high percentage of DNA, even with like leaves or things
bananas or something,
or banana or stuff like that too.
Depends on how you
string it together, how you bias it,
and how you look at it. Yep.
Right. Okay.
Because in one of my Creation Evolution rants, I talked about that number, and I cited that very example,
which
you mentioned.
From what perspective, it kind of makes sense that they would have to be if you're going to turn a banana into a human by eating it. Right?
I suppose, yes.
Like at least 50% or 60% of that banana needs to be similar enough to you genetically, or like as far as the makeup of it, if you're going to literally incorporate it into your body.
Yeah, and I can't remember. Well, I mean, if you don't look at it that way, we've only got 4 base pairs to choose from.
Right.
So you're going to be right off
There's
the bat.
Pretty similarity between a lot of living things, right?
So
the number percentage thing is kind of just a lost cause. It's not an important conversation to have.
It is. I when I did that Creation Evolution rant on the genetic similarity between humans and chimps, I actually cited multiple evolutionists who had argued about the similarity between humans and bananas.
Right.
I could not find a technical reference anywhere for that number. So I cited it, but to be honest, I'm not even sure it exists.
I think Evan just had 60% there. That's this Business Insider.
Yeah.
Pop
So
science
I mean,
article
Business
has.
Insider. Clearly, they know all.
They know their
genetics.
stuff.
Yeah. But I was never able to find a reference.
This is where we go into Google Scholar.
Yeah.
That's right.
I forgot about this feature. Google scholar.google.com. There we go. Evan's a real smart
boy. I had to do this for school, you know.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Genetic diversity and
diploid bananas. Okay.
PCR you have to know how to search with it a bit differently because it's not quite.
You're looking for like scholarly articles when you do Scholar.
Yeah.
This is a neat feature to have. I didn't realize I had this so handy.
This would take a while to weed through.
Yeah. I don't think we have time to do that. But so you said, I mean, that one of the things people point to is that, we were kind of on skeletons here. We're talking about fossils and stuff like that.
Yes.
So there are none that you find even sort of like difficult to process or like kind of trip you up at all? It's like, okay, all that seems like it's just faked,
It's well, and that it's not that it's faked,
or at least just
It's-
biased.
It's how it's interpreted.
Okay.
Yeah, let's put it that way. Because
I can appreciate that perspective a little bit more, because the idea that just literally everybody else is part of a conspiracy to try to suppress creationism just seems unlikely to me. I think most conspiracies of that type, where it's just like thinking that there's, because we can't even get, we can't even get a community of Christians who supposedly should have community figured out better than other cultures,
right,
to cooperate and believe each other and trust each other well enough, even in sort of close proximity. How do you get a bunch of people who are not that connected to each other and don't have any sort of incentive to care about what each other thinks, other than how do you get them to cooperate and like suppress knowledge intentionally? Like that's a organizational feat, especially to do it for a long time. Like that would be crazy. It has to be something a little bit more sneaky than that, where it just kind of sneaks into our biases and what seems to be true.
Yeah,
from a certain.
And as a few evolutionists have mentioned, the popular science can be really unintentionally harmful in that regard, because it propagates a lot of things like that Ascent of Man picture, which even Stephen Jay Gould went on record saying, this is not an accurate depiction.
Right, but you have to sort of sacrifice accuracy for simplicity, or like narrative simplicity. Yeah. Like, even if you talk about the way the model of an atom is usually represented in a science book, it's like that's
which
totally
may or may not be right.
Well, as far as I think it's like basically like it's intentionally way off, but it's just like it's a very simplified, like these are not the patterns that the electrons spin around the neutrons or the protons. This is just like
right.
This is like a really simplistic way of kind of understanding generally how it works, right? But it's like if you wanted to be accurate, the distance between those electrons and the neutrons, for you to be able to see the electrons, you end up having to have a picture that takes up like a football field, because the electrons are so far away from the neutrons. If you still want to see the electron, have it be the big sizes of a pinhead or whatever. Yes. It's like that it doesn't work. So you have to like is it a lie to sort of kind of throw off accuracy for representational
and that's
comprehension?
And that's not what I'm saying either. But at the same time, how many people have been convinced of evolution by that simple picture? Because it's depicted as fact,
right?
And when evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould have to go on record and say no, it's not,
right?
So
but like it might just be people sort of approaching our relationship to facts a little bit wrong. Like the way that you make a statement about reality is always you sort of compress it to an appropriate narrative level where people can understand what you're saying. It's like if you try to be like exhaustively detailed in your definitions, even of the word you're trying to say in a sentence, you can spend years trying to be so specific so people know exactly what you're saying. But it's like, it's not a lie not to do that, is it?
No. But what winds up happening is it winds up in not just popular science, but textbooks as well.
Right.
Now, science teachers are teaching it as a fact, showing this, and it is a real nice picture. It's very simple, and it shows the
But doesn't it represent a more or less the scientific consensus as far as like, where a lot of people that are working on the theory of evolution, they think that this is the case, and so they're just trying to represent it simply.
That's a lot more accurate than I think a lot of people would realize. Basically, I don't want to call it wishful thinking, because that's not, even though one evolutionist I know of used that term. That's not the term I'm using, or the term I want to use. See, I lost my train of thought again. Man, we had to do this today. I'm exhausted now.
I'm sorry to catch you after a crazy 2 days of your car breaking and everything.
Yes, and my brain is baked tonight. But
it's anyway. All good. We're trying to talk about how to understand what facts are and how to understand. Like these people are representing, this is not a very good, or at least not a very accurate, not a very detailed. But I'm kind of saying I'm not sure if that's necessarily a problem, especially if it's sort of, because it's not. I don't think the intent there behind that picture is to like give an exhaustive representation of exactly what happens. It's supposed to give you sort of a gist.
Correct. Right. But how many people know that?
Well, I mean, but this is a really general problem with just how we interact with truth and theories in general. I mean, I think this problem exists all the way up and down our experience with almost every discipline.
Yes.
And I mean, that just is a tendency towards non-humility when interacting with any discipline or any science or any information.
And unfortunately, in this day and age of fake news, I mean, this was kind of before your time, but I mean, Mel Brooks, Moses comes out, I present to you the 15 commandments, and he drops one of the tablets, the 10 commandments, and a bunch of people believe that was through history. It's like, so you can't win for losing. I mean,
right.
So, but coming back to this with, because again, all the major players in evolutionary scholars were reporting finding fossil humans at these sites. And again, coming back to this very common question, where's all the human fossils? There's, and I kind of wish I'd known we were going in this direction. I would have brought some displays, but that also requires organizational skills. And the Lord gifted me with many gifts and callings and skills, but organization was not one of them. So, fossil replica I just recently got was one of the women of Guadalupe. Guadalupe Island, and there was multiple. They call it Lady of Guadalupe. If you know how to spell Guadalupe.
You know how to spell of.
Yes, Lady of Guadalupe.
Okay.
No, not that one.
Maybe Lady of Guadalupe fossil?
Yes.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay.
There it is.
So this
Mystery of
looks
the
like some
Guadalupe
icon.
woman. Or that one there. Yeah. So, bad archaeology. I love it. So I have a cast of that skeleton now. So basically, this was in rocks that were far too old for humans to have evolved at that point.
Okay.
If I recall, it was 12.
Can you bring up the website, Evan, the bad archaeology website that's there? You were just there a second ago. Go back to the images. Maybe try to thumb through that article, because I wonder what that has to say about this conversation too.
So John Mackay, who is an Australian, he's a geologist.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, this goes back a ways. There was a guy by the name of Bill. It was after the flood. I've forgotten his last name. He wrote this book, and he spent a pile of time in the basement of the British Museum of Natural History.
Okay.
Where that skeleton was on display for some 50 years in the British Museum. But it's in the wrong place from an evolutionary perspective. It should not be there. The rock is too old, according to them. So that skeleton, basically, Bill just said, here's this skeleton here. He showed photographs of it and talked about it in his book, Bill Cooper. So he publicized this in his book after the flood. And there was a bit of a firestorm, because then Chris Stringer, the curator of the museum at the time, they hauled out the skeleton and said, look, here, we're not hiding it, and raised a bit of a ruckus. He took it quite personally, the suggestion that, they were hiding fossils in the basement, even though really they weren't. They weren't talking about this, nothing, and they only brought it out because Bill Cooper publicized it.
Okay.
So what became of that, there was a lot of, they really hassled Bill Cooper over this. So John Mackay decides, well, let's settle this issue. So he goes to the island of Guadalupe, and he conducts a geologic survey, because, surprise, surprise, the whole island was geologically surveyed except for the location where the skeletons were found. So he traced it back and did a geological survey with everything, comes back, and he goes to visit Dr. Stringer, the curator of the British Museum, in his office, lays out all the papers, says, here it is, according to the geological time frame, which you guys are proposing, that rock is 12 million years old, which is way too old for modern humans. And Stringer was, he calmed down a lot after that, because he basically conceded, okay, yeah, that rock, it leads to other questions, right?
Okay.
And John pinned him down, and he asked him bluntly, he said, how many human fossils do you know of? And Stringer thought about it for a second. He says, about 30,000 or so. And I don't know about you, but John, myself, when I heard this, my jaw hit the floor. 30,000 human fossils? I haven't heard about these fossils. Nobody's heard about these fossils.
Right.
Where are all these fossils? So, I mean, the question is that people so often have, and it is a good question. Where's all the human fossils? That's a really good question because, Chris Stringer, one guy talking about knowing about 30,000 of them. That's one guy.
Right.
So why haven't we heard about these? The Paluxy fossil human footprints would be another classic example. Okay. Those are fossil human footprints. We know they're not apes because there is no creature that has a footprint like the human. Even apes have basically 4 hands.
Okay.
I was reading about the Lady of Guadalupe, and some people were saying that the guy who originally posted the article about it, or wrote the article about it, was suspicious. So,
yeah, they always say that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like the bottom of this is that there's, especially, this conversation got fiery about 200 years ago or so, it seems like, where it started to be the case. Because, I mean, I think before like American Protestantism and the kind of separation of church and state, I think it was generally the church's position, like there wasn't a hard line separation between like creationism and evolution. It was just like the scientists thought that there was that believed in evolution, and Christians didn't have like a hardline opinion. If they were into science, they were generally into the evolutionary perspective.
That actually is very recent. Before the advent of Charles Lyell, really. He's the one who introduced the whole idea.
When is he? Lyell is 1800s?
Yeah, 1800s, just before Darwin. He was actually one of the inspirations for Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin had his book, his book on board the Beagle with him, and he read it. And he was inspired by this. Now,
the present is the key to the past.
Yes.
His epistemological framework is
and
that everything's consistent.
And it's a fascinating study. I mean, my first complete creation series, I spent the first, I think, 4 or 5 parts just on that topic.
Right.
Because to me, Charles Lyell was more important than Charles Darwin.
Okay.
Because he was the one that convinced countless numbers of people that the Bible could not be true. And it was how he did it, which he secretly admitted in writing in private correspondence, which we only found out about after he died.
Right.
Because his sister published his letters and correspondence.
Okay.
So that's the only reason we even know what was going through his mind, is because he was trained as a lawyer. Right. And so he put his legal argumentation training to work, and he had an interest in geology. But he wanted to refute Noah's flood, and he wanted to replace it with deep time. So he was basically the inventor of millions and billions of years. And he specifically came up with that to explain away the evidence left behind by the worldwide flood.
Which, okay, I haven't heard that before, that he was the first one to, I mean, I as far as, I was watching some of your early lectures about this guy, and that he kind of made this statement. But I forget where the other sources where I was reading about this, but just like I was under the impression that, like, in general, there wasn't this hardline debate before around that time, and like there was a kind of a growing like Lyell was literally the first one to talk about an Earth older than 6,000 or 10,000 years old.
Yep, and he did it without ever mentioning the Bible. So basically, he refuted the Bible, and that was
see if you can look this one up, because that just doesn't sound right to me. Like, the first person to believe in old Earth, or first references to.
No, he wasn't the first to believe in an old Earth. He was the first to popularize it, and the first to replace the evidence of Noah's flood with deep time.
Okay,
which is what sold everybody, basically.
So let's talk about the flood a little bit, because so you believe like in a a global flood where the entire globe gets covered in water, where did all the water go?
Well,
I don't know. That's the first thing that I could think of as far as like, because it seems like, okay, if there was enough water to cover the entire globe, then did it just sort of, I mean, unless there used to be a lot more land mass and it sort of gathered together into smaller.
Basically, that is the short answer. Basically, the water's in the oceans.
Right.
Is where all the water went. Now, how that happened, personally, I'm that is arguable. But basically, the continents were squished horizontally and grew vertically as a result. And so basically what happens is this displaces the water. The water goes off into...
Yeah. I mean, physically that kind of makes sense to me. And there's sort of evidence for them changing shape that much, because that seems like that would be a pretty crazy...
Not so much changing that much, but moving around a lot.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's sort of Pangea theory and then tectonic plates and all that.
Yeah, which is a biblical idea that actually came from the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, it was because I've forgotten his name right now. I should have drank 2 5-hour before this. It was before the idea of plate tectonics.
Okay.
Because those two guys, do that, yeah.
Well, is it to do with like Genesis and how all these rivers, apparently used to meet together, like the Tigris, Euphrates, all that?
Right. No, it was before that, because basically, when you refer back to Genesis, it says God had all the land, gathered the waters together into one place.
Okay,
is what it said. So this, I believe he was French, and I've totally forgotten his name.
Sorry, I remember more names today than I am.
That's going to keep me awake tonight now. So basically, he looked at that and deduced, well, if the water was gathered into one place, then that means the land was gathered into one place. And so that's when he started playing around with the fit of continents, trying to figure out, because they're not all in one place now.
Right.
So he was simply looking at this and trying to, not Alfred Wegener, Antonio Snyder Pellegrini.
That sounds Italian.
Yeah, something like that.
He was
French.
French.
Oh, he was French, but okay, that sounds Italian.
Brazilian, I don't know.
okay.
It's all the same.
The French. Oh, somewhere in Europe.
In fact, if you click on that, I'm sure it'll even have his first. He's a French geographer.
Sorry, if you want to hit the camera again, I think it went out.
And that is his famous drawing right there.
His drawing. Okay, so he's the one who sort of started theorizing about them all being put together before it was called Pangea.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so basically, Wegener and his partner took that idea. Before we had this hardline split between sort of the scientific institution and Christianity, which I'm still not exactly sure why that happened so violently, but before that, it was just like a lot of people were the reason they even did science was like there was a theological drive to it was like theology drove everything. It's like now there's this weird kind of pretense that we do, like that science just wants us to get more science so that way we can keep getting more science and understanding science better. Yeah, and I'm all for that, because you know how it is. I love science.
Well, I mean, but that loop, that feedback loop doesn't make sense to me, because science, I mean, even as you kind of pointed out, science is a tool, right? So science doesn't sort of lead you anywhere. It doesn't tell you what to do with it. It just says, it's just
cool.
Right. It's just, but why is it cool, right? That's a interesting thing to point to, is like, so what's coolness? It's like, there's something that it's like it leads us toward, I mean, cool, that is a really catch-all general phrase that has to do with like a mysterious sense of like what you're drawn to. So I mean, I would
be like discovery, I guess.
Right. And like, I mean, I like the sort of more mystical scientific talkers like Sagan who end up using this sort of very, very, romantic language for like the discovery of science, and where science is ultimately leading towards like truth. Right. I don't even know if he ever does truth with a capital T, but like ultimately, that's what science sort of ought to be. It's a tool to help us grapple with the true nature of reality, which right to me would be like ultimately heading towards the like God behind reality, or at the bottom or the top, or all within reality.
Right.
Like there's a drive towards something that's meaningful, and like just doing science for the sake of science or for the sake of your job to make money is like. Well, I mean, sooner or later you realize sort of your life. I mean, just making money is not that meaningful. It's like you want to be driven beyond something beyond that. And so then like, okay, well, is it just science for the sake of science? But then you just get a bigger and bigger tool asking you what to do with the tool.
Right.
Right. And so there has to be sort of something driving behind that. And like up to a certain point, it was clearly Christianity. Now I think it's sort of a more masked version of like still Christian values and this desire for God, but like there's too much baggage on Christian creeds and Christian what would you say? What's the word I'm looking for? Like dogma.
Oh yes,
the Christian dogma is something a lot of people struggle with. I mean, and there is a lot of sort of social and historical baggage attached to the dogmas of Christianity. Right. So like, I can see why some people want to kind of scoot around that and just use more romantic, mystical language to talk about the truth they're looking for. Because I think within Christianity we have kind of, I think we struggle to maintain a relationship with the unknownness of God very well.
Right.
We want to like, I mean, in the same way we had this sort of representation of the potential of the like the evolutionary chain of like ape to man. People can get caught up in that and just be like, oh, well, that's what it is. It's like it's simple as that, and I understand that that's the fact. It's like we similarly do that to talk about God and to talk about truth, and we have kind of a just a simple model to try to get the gist of it, and we look to that model and say, well, that's what God is. And it's like, no, that's not what God is. Right? There has to be a relationship to the unknown to properly engage with these things. So I know that's kind of a bit of a tangent, but
tangents are okay.
Well, I mean,
if you want to tack it on and be controversial, you could make the comparison that the visual model of the Trinity is similar to the. It's like it's a good model,
but like this is a fundamental problem of doing any sort of truth seeking or epistemology is that you always have a what did I say before, something bias, confirmation bias, right? Which, and that's what you were pointing to, is that if you're bought into an evolutionary model, you approach truth or you approach science with that bias. And as a creationist, we do that too, because there's no way to sort of like deal with new facts without plugging them into sort of a story about reality.
Yes, and I'm trying to remember the exact quote that Gary Parker would always say, but it was we're all biased, and you need to know which bias is the correct bias to be biased with.
Right, but I don't think that's totally possible.
Yeah,
I think that's part of why it's like even within Christian theology, it's like it's so important to be relational with our seeking of truth and seeking of God. It's like that's why like the church is a fundamental part of Christianity. It's like you don't get to know what's the right bias. You have to constantly be renegotiating that with the whole rest of the body.
Right.
Right? I mean that's important. But like, so it's important that we understand we have a bias, and it's important that we are humble enough to kind of work through our biases together, right? But so how do you? I mean, plugging that back into this conversation, I mean, you're pointing to that there's a bias when looking at things from an evolutionary perspective, and there's one from a creationist perspective too. How much of that bias explains away the evidence that supports the creation model as well? Like,
you'll notice that in the case of the hominid fossils, the half ape, half human.
Okay.
I focused heavily, and I still focus heavily, on quoting the evolutionists and what they say.
Okay.
So I'm simply agreeing with them. It's the better part of what I'm doing there, right?
Right.
And when it comes to the creationary stuff, it's in general, I'm thinking, because they're all, how can I put this? They're all very little, small, specific clusters of a debate. What, the model of Noah's flood, what caused the flood? Why did the flood stop?
Mm-hmm.
Where did all the water come from? Where did it go? There's, a number of models, each of which has their strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
So even the evolutionary Pangea models, they have their strengths and weaknesses, every single one of them.
Right, and there's a whole bunch, right? I think we should also make sure that we kind of, in general, are not looping or lumping together, just like, I mean, we're trying to keep this conversation manageable too by having a general category for evolutionary theory and creationist theory. Both of these things, there's a lot more nuance to the conversations that are happening in those two.
Yeah, and it's
like, it's not a uniform theory of evolution or even a uniform theory of creation. There's a ton of noise, a ton of conversation, and a ton of like
nuance. That's the word I'm looking
but
for.
also probably disagreements. Like there's a lot of conflicting models within these things, and so it's difficult to get a bottom line.
Yeah, a lot of creationists reject the Paluxy fossil footprints.
Okay,
that's something I've spent a great deal of time studying. I've spent a lot of hours in the Paluxy River. And examining the footprints in place. I've been to multiple excavations. I've studied a lot of these footprints, developed some of the techniques for studying the footprints, which very quickly went by the way of the dodo bird with new technology. But the principle is there anyway. So I mean, I can address all those objections. But that doesn't mean that there isn't people out there who disagree with me or think I'm wrong. So
okay. Well, that's what I was wondering even too, is so within, to focus on even the place where and the fossils you spend a lot of your time like working on. You said the Paluxy River. I don't know if you can even pull that up too, but are you working mostly with people who are looking at things from a similar perspective, like a creation model, and having dialogue with them, or is there some kind of interplay between? Like, because if this is as extraordinary of evidence for creation as you're saying it is, I would imagine that either there would be a lot of evolutionary archaeologists out there sort of trying to disprove the evidence, or like just ignoring it. So what's happening there with the relationship between the different communities?
Mostly ignoring it, but primarily almost all of them point to the research of one guy and basically say, well, he said that they're just elongated dinosaur tracks.
Elongated?
Yes. So basically, a dinosaur was walking on its heels. And so this left a vaguely human-looking, human footprint-shaped looking impression in the mud.
Okay, and this article says the Paluxy River, the creationist Piltdown.
Yes. The National Center of Science Eradication. Yes. One of my favorite groups.
Science eradication. Yes. Okay, it says science education there.
Yes. And they'll all quote the same guys anyway, and the same arguments. Now, these guys will be a little more careful because, to their credit, at least they tend to they do their homework at least.
Right.
And
they care about it.
Yeah. They don't, because 9 times out of 10, when someone argues against the Paluxy River tracks, they say they're all carvings.
They're carvings?
Yes. They're faked. That's the number one argument. Now, anybody who's been to any of the excavations will know that is an absolutely absurd argument because there's public excavations that have been going on for decades.
Right.
You
can
keep
finding
down,
new ones.
Yeah, and they're uncovering these underneath, anywhere from 6 to 18 inches of solid limestone. You got to break away the limestone, and I've done a whole pile of that, breaking up and carrying it away, and then you got to remove the mud layer on top of it to get to the tracks. How are they carvings? It's absurd.
Right.
But yet,
so you even uncovered these things like footprints yourself? Yes.
Now I haven't had the privilege of uncovering a human one yet.
Okay, but dinosaur ones.
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yes. But I have, because it's actually illegal to remove the tracks from the riverbed now.
Okay.
So the human footprints which have been found, almost all of them are still in the riverbed. So they get eroded over time, which is actually a very important point. Right. Because when you go and look at the trails, the dinosaur footprints erode radically different than the human footprints.
Okay.
So they're not the same track. Because sometimes the human footprints are inside the dinosaur track, or sometimes the dinosaur track is on top of the human footprint.
Okay.
So one walked in the mud, and then later a second one walked.
And how are there like dinosaur bones nearby to be certain that these are dinosaur tracks?
In that particular case, there's only dinosaur tracks can be quite common.
Yeah.
But they are almost never found with dinosaur bones.
Okay.
So, and the Paluxy happens to be one of the rare places in the world where there was dinosaur bones found.
Okay.
With
And what kind of dinosaurs are you talking about? Like, because I know like some of the later dinosaurs are potentially like these large like bird type dinosaurs. I mean, it seems to go like there's the model is that. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure that we're having this in good faith, and I'm not just trying to throw out the creationist perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, from the evolutionary model, it's like lizard type dinosaur dragon things, and then eventually very large bird type things, and then chickens eventually.
Right. Kentucky Fried Chicken. There we go.
Yeah.
In that case, it was Acrocanthosaurus.
Okay.
And that was again.
Can you look that up? I want to see what that looks like. How do you spell that?
Acro. Acrocan.
Oh wow, it was down there. Okay. So this is sort of a semi-bird looking thing, or at least it stands up and walks, but this is huge looking.
Yes.
Okay.
They can be quite big.
Okay, but it likely still had scales, not feathers.
Yeah, and that whole feather debate, that's a tough one. I don't have a problem with feathers on a dinosaur.
Yeah.
I mean, do I have a problem with a duckbill on a duckbill platypus?
Yeah.
No. So,
right.
Why not? But unfortunately, the whole argumentation over the feathers on dinosaurs has in itself become almost a religion, where they look under a microscope and they see hairs and they call those proto feathers.
Okay. Yeah.
And they call them proto feathers.
They actually find like close to living enough models that they can see these hairs on them. Like
yes,
some of
them are that well preserved. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so nuts to think about.
Yes. Yes. I've gotten to study a few myself in person, and they're pretty stunning.
Okay.
But one of the things they'll point out, for example, is these hairs are hollow. So they're proto feathers. They're it's trying to evolve feathers because it's like the quill of a feather. Okay, fair enough argument.
Which is weird. I wouldn't understand the advantage of I guess hair over especially if your eyes you can only really see in one direction pretty well, and you're pretty big. Hair would be helpful because it becomes another indicator for predators or anything around you. Even parasites, you can sense them more quickly. So. Maybe there would be an advantage there. That kind of makes sense.
Right. Well, and in that case, they were leaning heavily like these hairs are hollow, so they must be proto feathers.
Right. Okay.
But the thing is, there's multiple animals today that have hollow feathers, and in fact, it's a seasonal thing. Polar bears, for example, in the summer will have a non-hollow fur, and I've actually got photographs of polar bear fur that I took under a microscope. I got it from in Cochrane. I got some polar bear hair samples, and I actually snipped one of them and put it under the microscope to take a look at it. And in the wintertime, their hair is hollow.
Interesting.
Moose as well, caribou as well.
Do we know a reason for that? Like, is it is it an insulation thing or?
It must be. I'm honestly not sure, but it's a seasonal thing.
Okay.
So, and the emphasis there would be that perhaps this dinosaur is not evolving feathers. It's simply got a winter coat of fur.
Right. Okay.
So that changes the argument radically.
Well, so it doesn't sound like it necessarily is here or there. Just like, okay. I mean, for evolution to work, it always has to be like, there has to be either an advantage enough to spend your biological resources on this change, or at least not damaging enough that you deviate away from it, that it ends up being a problem, right? So it's just like initially there'd be sort of a random mutation that we end up having it, and if there's some sort of positive, it ends up being somewhat pragmatic, then it sticks around. But then, it's interesting to trying to understand this step to this step to this step. It's like any evolutionary sort of plot of like this to this to this always is missing a whole bunch of steps, especially because you're looking at, thousands and thousands of generations,
right?
It's like you got to do a lot of gap filling in. So and I think even obviously from an evolutionary science perspective, that's an assumption that you are doing that, and you're sort of generalizing, you're filling in the gaps in a huge way, And so like there's a high percentage that you're like I mean, you just give your best guess, and then until somebody else has a better guess, we go with your best guess.
Yeah.
Unless we can sort of falsify it. And it's like, if you're sort of, I don't know, like I'm not super uncomfortable with that sort of thinking as long as everybody's sort of on the same page about, you know, how we're doing science. Although, I mean, I can't say we're doing science. You're actually doing science.
But, well, except asking questions is doing the science too.
Okay.
So,
okay. Yeah.
To be fair. Because, I mean, that's an important and critical part.
Right.
You know, you got to ask the question. And in fact, John Mackay does this routinely, and it's an excellent question. If creation were true, what would the evidence be?
Right.
You know, we always think about, you know, if evolution were true, what would the evidence be? We're all taught that. I was taught that.
Yeah.
You know, but nobody ever asks, if creation were true, what would the evidence be?
Yeah.
And so one of the things he points out is the fossil record. What do we see in the fossil record? Stasis and extinction, neither of which help evolution at all. Stasis is no change.
Right.
And
so evolution is more of just and what I said as far as before about evolutionary theory, like the evidence seemed interesting, seemed compelling to me. I probably used the wrong word. Evidence is too much of a scientific word. What I meant is more the narrative or the movement, the story that it helps me to kind of think about reality and the general gist of reality. I found that helpful. It's like, okay, that sort of makes sense. Like he talked about, you know, in the Selfish Gene, talked about small, you know, examples of evolution, and obviously there are examples you can watch of like cells evolving to like become resistant to different types of poisons. You can literally watch these, and you can look at pictures of it. It's really cool to look at. So obviously, it's like, okay, that's a really compelling story about how we adapt to change. And it's like, okay, so we have certain people claiming that the Earth and the universe is this old. So how did we get here? Well, let's try and use the most interesting and compelling stories we have about the way life works so far to try to tell a story about that.
Right.
And like, that doesn't seem to be a problem to me. It's like, okay, again, like people can sort of approach it wrong and look at it as sort of definitive. And it's like, to some extent, I understand that, especially for how long it's been sort of the dominant theory in a lot of countries and for a lot of scientists. So, I mean, part of me would wonder, like, why wouldn't we have discovered the serious problems with this yet? If it's been consensus for so long, or been the way people are sort of approaching science for so long, wouldn't they start to run into big problems? And obviously, there's a lot of conversational avenues we can go down about just like how institutions end up getting corrupted and how we're doing science at this point, and how it's difficult to, you know, to maintain. I love listening to this guy Eric Weinstein talk about in general. I don't know if you follow this guy at all.
I know the name.
Okay. Anyway, he's really concerned about a couple of key things. He's really good at coming up with little catchphrases, little names for things. But he has one of his favorite riffs to go on is he talks about the G.I.N., which is the gated institutional narrative, which is he just talks about
right.
how, you know, once an institution is formed, it has and this is another word he's coined, an ego. It has an embedded growth obligation.
Right.
But I mean, ego is a good enough word anyways. It's just like, once it's big enough, it needs to keep feeding itself, because it's kind of established this pattern of like, okay, well, we get money and then we do this. And, you know, I got people to pay and I have growth to do. And so like institutions, whether or not they are continue to be useful or not, have an obligation to kind of continue to survive. Right. And so that can end up leading to a lot of problems. And so if somebody brings up something that would sort of destabilize one of the core foundational stones of any institution, they want to suppress that or get rid of it or try to hide it. So basically he just uses fancy words to talk about conspiracy theories.
Yes, basically, yes.
But like a lot, I mean, it's just like, I like the way he talks about it, because he doesn't talk about it as if it's like one guy, George Soros out there, or one guy out there sort of masterminding everything and having a secret puppet hand behind everything and orchestrating it all. It's more just like, these are the sort of patterns we fall into as institutions, as people. It's just, and I like using the word ego or pride. It's just, pride is a pattern that manifests on every level, on the level of the human, on the level of the family, level of the institution. It's like, it makes sense. And so, yeah, you see people sort of suppressing. Sorry, that was one of the avenues I didn't want to go down.
Yep.
But yeah, I can see that it would be possible for people to kind of get mixed up in this, but I don't feel like whenever you start suppressing information and hiding truth, that usually you end up. Well, I mean, there's a lot of just dramatic representations of this pattern in like kids' stories. Like I feel like there's an episode of Arthur that just talks about. I mean, there's so many kids shows that just talk about like, when you tell one lie, the next you have to tell another lie to cover it up, and somebody approaches you on that, you got to tell another lie. It's like lies snowball, and eventually your whole structure becomes too unstable to manage, and things just fall apart. But that hasn't seemed to have happened with the evolutionary institution and people approaching things that way. And I'm wondering why it hasn't happened yet.
Because it boils down to human nature. We are in a fallen world. We that confirmation bias thing again, but it's deeper than that, I would say.
Yeah, I'm willing to sacrifice the heat for some cool. Maybe we'll have a little bit of sound here, but I think the dynamic mics will do an okay job. You want to turn the air conditioning back on? Sacrificing quality for comfort. But maybe it will lead to more quality content because we'll be less focused on the heat. Okay. So sorry, you're talking about cognitive bias, yes.
Yes, except it's deeper than that. Because by nature we want to reject acknowledging our sinful state. I don't know how to put that. It's deeper than that. It is confirmation bias.
Well, I mean, to put our sinful state into more, I don't know, easier terms for me to follow. Like we don't want to, on the same level as sort of the institution doesn't want to destabilize itself with new facts that are gonna hurt its structures. Mm-hmm. It doesn't want to have to incorporate that into itself. I don't want to have to do that either. Is that a good analogy as far as like our sinful state, our potential, our imperfection, our
yes, because basically what I've seen happen in debates in particular. Now, to his credit, while I think I spent 3 episodes of Genesis Week just pointing out the glaring errors and fallacies that Bill Nye brought up during the debate with Ken Ham. Mm-hmm. To his credit, he at least tried to argue the points. Mm-hmm. While his arguments were completely invalid.
And I appreciated the difference in vibe in that interaction compared to like Hitchens, Krauss, Dawkins. All these guys have just a real stick up their butt when it comes to talking about religion. They're just really they're not in it for science. They're in it to be anti-religion, and that seemed to be that's a problem. You can't really do science if you come with such a negative bias towards your opponent.
And evolution is their religion, is the bottom line.
Sure.
So I mean, to his credit, Bill Nye actually did bring up multiple points. Whether you agree with them or not, he at least brought up arguments. Mm-hmm. Usually, when I've been in a debate with various evolutionary scholars or evolutionists, they almost never try and bring up scientific facts and data. They always incorporate logical fallacies. Start attacking me personally. What's your credentials? That's the most common one. Yeah. Which has absolutely nothing to do with whether what I'm saying is correct or not.
Right. Which I mean, I forget who. There's a lot of scientists that talk about that. If you want to do science, you don't make appeals to authority. You make appeals to facts.
That's another logical fallacy. It's quite common. Right. Battery just died.
Okay. If you want to try and set up my phone to keep going, so we have another camera in case that runs out. Sorry, keeping you working hard today, Evan. Sorry, we keep going. We got this guy going. So.
Oh, okay. That is another common logical fallacy. For instance, they'll bring up in a debate, well, give me one peer-reviewed article, which is a appeal to authority.
Right. Well, it's an appeal to authority, but it's also an appeal to, like, the shared sense making of a lot of people. So I partially appreciate that. Like, you want to make sure that if you're making a claim, you have your peers review it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Right. Well, don't get me started on peer review.
Yeah, no, I know there's a problem within that system as well. But at least fundamentally, like it makes sense that you want to try to review things, among your peers.
Yes, The problem is the peers. If you and
If you're all bought into an institution together,
it's because it doesn't become peer review anymore. Now it becomes what's the word?
who's part of the club?
Close. Branding. That's
Okay.
It becomes branding. You know, if Nature magazine says we will only publish peer-reviewed papers that support evolution, all right, that's fair enough. But that has nothing to do with science. That has everything to do with branding.
Yeah.
So to then turn around and say, well, Nature won't publish creationary content, that means creation isn't science.
Right, but
It's a no.
if there was a ton of, and there should be a ton of evidence to support, well, I mean, it's like maybe there's just the falsifiability question hasn't been set up right. But if there's a lot of data that should support creationism, and we should just be sort of finding that all the time, then there would be a lot of suppression, like a lot of suppression, and a lot of people just sort of willingly overlooking data.
There is.
I mean,
The Creation Research Society has published the Quarterly magazine, which is a creation-based peer-reviewed journal. They've been publishing that since the 60s. We're talking thousands of peer-reviewed articles. That's one journal. Then you got Answers Research Journal. You've got Creation Journal.
because I mean, that is an interesting, like, it's a difficult thing to start to try to deal with if you want to, like, if you're looking at things from my perspective, it's like you want to sort of just throw away anybody who thinks about because I mean the people that I usually am talking to about creationism is either like I'm listening to scientists talk about evolution, or I'm listening to my uncle or just some guy in my church who isn't a scientist and can't really engage that much with the history of the arguments. And it's like, obviously the scientist wins because you're just kind of throwing random stuff around. But like, in this case, I'm not excluding you from that category. I'm considering you somebody who's actively trying to do science.
Yeah,
but
it's because I get asked that question from a conspiracy theory perspective.
Yeah,
because basically people have said flat out, the way you're talking, it sounds like a conspiracy. No, except perhaps how does that term go? Conspiracy, not by omission.
not by commission, but by omission. Because there's a sort of sin quote about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh my goodness. Yeah, my brain.
But it's not an active conspiracy by a mastermind, but it's sort of just a pattern that we fall into as groups.
Yes. Yeah, is basically what I'm.
But again, like, I mean, that still doesn't sort of deal with that. Like, okay, if you fall into that pattern too deeply as a group, eventually your group falls apart because you have to have people sort of keep ignoring. Like,
except people want to believe it.
Okay, so that it's connected to this sort of not wanting to admit what, or like, because so maybe we should go from here because it seems like probably the reason this debate got so fiery in the beginning is because there was a comparison, or it was a compare and contrast, or like either you believe in a young Earth and therefore the Bible, and therefore that you're sinful, and therefore all these other things that people were having difficulty processing and were frustrating, or they felt disenfranchised by a lot of dogmas. It's like all these things were sort of lumped together. This is the Christian perspective. And so if I can discount that, then I don't have to engage with the Christian perspective anymore. Is that what Lyell was more or less trying to do?
Yeah, which is, Lyell was a strange case because he also spoke religiously.
Okay.
And in some ways even supportive of the Christian faith.
Okay, interesting.
But yet you take a look at it, again, his private writings and correspondence, and it's stunning and profound what he wrote. And he even said in writing, he came up with this idea of how to dispel the history according to Moses.
Right. So we need to go into history according to Moses, because I mean, the way I look at the whole beginning of the Bible is probably a lot different than the way you approach it.
Okay.
And I mean, I can maybe kind of understand where you're coming from, but I need to probably hear it from your mouth to kind of to get a little bit closer to where you're at, because like to me, it seems like we're sort of expecting a bit. We're kind of coming with the wrong priors to approach, the Torah, these earliest books in the Bible, to try to treat them like scientific books.
Correct. I would call them history books.
Okay. So that actually helps, I think, because but the way you can write history is going to be different depending on what you're trying to communicate.
Yes.
And your language
Yep.
and your culture.
Yep.
And so, I mean, as far as I could understand from, secular and Christian, when we're talking about the Bible, we're talking about a lot of religious scholars or scholars who these texts mean something to them. They're not sort of just trying to discard them. A lot of people that spend time with these, it seems that a lot of scholars are saying, Genesis wasn't written by the hand of Moses necessarily. It was written by probably about 5 different authors and sort of compiled. And that, the sort of mythical nature or like really, really epic nature of a lot of these stories is sort of has a lot to do with the way they mixed history and poetry in that time.
Okay.
And I mean,
what about Jesus?
Why do we go to Jesus when we're talking about the difference between? I mean, if we're talking about different kinds of texts, right? We're talking about the way Greeks thought about and tried to record history, and they talked about truth.
Because Jesus quoted Noah and the worldwide flood as a real people.
I see where you're
real events.
Well,
Adam and Eve were the first.
I've heard that, but I don't kind of draw that conclusion when I hear Jesus referencing these people. It's like when I talk about. When I talk about a lot of people that I'm not really sure how historical the stories we have about them, I still reference them because they're sort of cultural characters that we can reference, and there's ideas embedded in those stories. It's like I talk about Achilles, or I talk about the Buddha. I talk about various people who, like, it's ancient enough history. I mean, whenever when you get past a certain date, it becomes a lot. I don't know. You have this sort of mysterious relationship with trying to understand, okay, how historical is that? How different is their understanding of, or even their intention for how they want to communicate and record information than mine? Like there's a gradual difference in, and a gradual difficulty. And the more ancient you get, the more or the less sure you can be. You're sort of on the same page about how you're trying to make sense of the world.
Which again, I bring it back to Christ, because this was an allegory to him. When you read through the text, he spoke of Adam and Eve as real people. The fall in the Garden of Eden as a real event.
Right.
The apostles did as well. None of this was allegory or
how
parable.
Could we draw that distinction of like why would we say that he's not talking about it allegorically, or even talking about it sort of engaging their semi-historical mindset about these stories, that like, okay, this is like when you talk about what's his name, the guy who like conquered Alexander the Great. Like the stories we have about his life are sort of pretty loose and pretty hyperbolic. It's like the history is like we know it to be a sort of semi-myth, semi-historical account.
Okay.
And so when we think about it and we talk about it as a real person, and especially like a real story.
Right.
It's like it's a real historical story that is like, it's true, but not necessarily in the same or as deeply or focused on recording facts or observable scientific facts as we would be at this point, where our philosophy of science and even solving crime and all of these things are like, we have a lot more of an obsession with data at this point than I think we have historically.
Yes. And some of that data is Christ rising from the dead. So he demonstrated who he was. He demonstrated he knows something we don't.
Mm-hmm.
He spoke in parables in other places. So why would he not speak in parable form about Adam and Eve?
Well, does he always say, and this is a parable?
Fair enough. But again, when you look at it, as it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the day, or as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. Noah was a real person. Those days He's specifically referencing days and events historically, and saying it's going to happen again before Christ returns, and comparing now to then.
I mean, again, I think I see what you're saying, but it doesn't seem to me that there's that much of a not that much that impels me to go in that direction when reading or hearing Jesus say those things. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, he's referencing this, but it doesn't, like, the fact that he's referencing it doesn't say that much about the way in which, he's intending people to take it. Or again, we have to kind of look at the culture and the way those people would have heard these stories and these references. Like, do you think that they would have heard them that close to the way that you or I would with a sort of a simple reading? Like, I mean, when we talk about the resurrection of Christ, mm-hmm. that seems to be, I mean, that's still something I sort of wrestle with and struggle with, but like, it seems to be one of the least fuzzy features of these accounts. It's like everybody says this happened in more or less the same way. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of other details about the life of Jesus that are sort of seem to be hyperbolized. I don't know. Exaggerate. That's probably the better word. Okay. Exaggerated to focus on key points and like, and I don't have a problem with that. Like, I think that would be, again, just trying to record the story and record the events in a way that compresses the facts into something that people could digest, and it is the most meaningful way of compressing that knowledge. Because again, you'll always have that problem with whenever you're trying to communicate. You have to compress it into the appropriate level of simplicity.
Yes, but I think he would. I think it would be apparent. I mean, let's look at it from another perspective as well. Over and over again, we see in the Genesis account where God spoke something into existence.
Right.
So the miracles of Jesus, were they allegory? Were they just exaggerated? Or did they actually happen? And I would argue they actually happened, to the point where even the Pharisees didn't deny it.
Right.
So those.
I mean, yeah, I don't have as much. Sorry, I'm interrupting. I don't know where you're going with this, but I don't have as much of. I don't really have a problem with that, like saying that the miracles Jesus did were real events.
Right. But the point I'm getting at is, what did he do there? He spoke these miracles into existence.
Sure.
When he called Lazarus from the dead, he yelled in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth!"
Sure.
That. And, did that take place over millions of years, or did it happen?
No, I mean, like, that seems to be what's sort of so important about these. I mean, when I think about Genesis and the Torah, mm-hmm. these myths is the way I would refer to them. And I wouldn't say myth. I mean,
I know.
There's some baggage there as far as, like, myth being like, oh, just not true. Like.
Right.
I think myth is probably more true than a historical account.
Right.
In some sense of the word. But yeah, so we look at these myths as that's one of the most important features of that story, is that it talks about the power of the word, mm-hmm. right? And it's like it doesn't necessarily have to be that the historical event of God the Father having a mouth and speaking with his tongue and shaping air into words, so that way the words cause a miraculous thing to happen. It doesn't have to be that specific, that detailed, and that the analogy doesn't have to run that deep. It's just like the fact that it's phrased that way, and that lasted, and that's the story that God wanted us to keep and to hold on to and to shape our lives by. It's like that's important, and then Jesus acts that out. So I mean, you're pointing to a comparison there, and I think that's a valid point. Like, yes, you do speak miraculous things into existence, and you need to think the words are extremely powerful.
Except that was done to make a point,
right?
Because in Genesis, for instance, I talk about this in my lectures, the origin of life, for example, from a scientific perspective, it can't happen by natural processes. It just can't. It's physically impossible. So
for which? Sorry, for
the first life, the
origin
of the first
abiogenesis.
Life? Yeah,
okay.
Abiogenesis, basically.
Right.
So raising the dead is basically
abiogenesis. You're looking for. You have to have an A at the beginning.
So basically, raising Lazarus from the dead, that is bringing life from non-life. And he did it. How did he do it? He did it by speaking it. He didn't do it over millions of years. He did it now in front of everybody. He did it by speaking it into existence. So coming back to the Genesis account, he was simply doing exactly what he did and showing, hey, this is how it happened.
Right.
Because he spoke the things into existence, which included the creation of the first people. He spoke it into existence. And there's I don't know if I can explain that properly, but there is no scientific difference between speaking to dust and forming a man, and speaking to a dead body and bringing it to life.
Right, because both of them, these sort of, and I just learned this word, so I'm not trying to be showy, but I was watching another guy, John Vervaeke, talk about, and it kind of introduced me to the ideas of Plato and Socrates, which I was totally, dumb about before. But one of the really useful words that's kind of entered into my vocabulary since hearing him introduce some of these ideas is the idea of the eidos, or like eidetic identity, which I think that's even where identity comes from, is the eidos of the thing.
Okay.
Right? So the key feature of like the difference between the eidos of a thing, like its thingness, and just the features of the thing, is that the word he uses is structural, functional makeup of the thing. So it's not just the features, like when you're looking at a human body, if you have hands and feet and all the genetic material you need to have a human body, it's not really a human unless there's the feature of consciousness, right? If you just have all of those features, like, okay, you have to have hands and elbows and knees and feet. It's like, okay, if you just have all of those things, if they're not arranged functionally to be a human and are in this sort of cooperation where they're like keeping each other alive and sustaining each other and like in the proper orientation, like they're organized properly. If you don't have that, it's not a human, right? So but we don't exactly know, and this should be a common and not controversial thing to say about the human body. We don't know that much about how the human body fits together and what it's doing, and the reason the human body stays alive. We know enough to be dangerous, and enough to shut it off, and enough to sometimes turn it back on, and to correct certain things to the best extent of our understanding of what the human body is doing right now. But obviously there's a lot of big mistakes we've made as far as trying to understand the human body so far, like even like the appendix and things like that. Okay, we thought it was just a useless organ. Turns out there's more that has to do with that immune system and stuff like that to do with it, right? So there's a lot to do with the body. In fact, I would probably say most of what's going on in the body we haven't even tapped into yet.
Yeah, right? I think that's fair.
That's just sort of an intuitive statement. I'm not. I can't be sure about that. I don't know the science behind it, but I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
I mean, even just now take it a little more specific. The human brain,
right?
There's still
so much we don't know about it. I mean, the best we try to model it is that it's like a computer, but that's even way off, right?
Yeah, people are so paranoid about artificial intelligence, and it's like because I know something about artificial intelligence, right? And it's like, well, let's just say it's very artificial and not very intelligent, and just leave it at that, And they're trying to mimic. And again, this comes back to our limited knowledge, trying to mimic the way we think the brain works.
Right.
Even though a number of experts who have spent their lives studying the brain say there's much more to there that we don't even know where this is. We don't know where.
The way you spell it, Evan, is E.I.G.O.s. That's why I was getting it wrong.
E.G.O.s. Oh,
yes.
That's the name of a video game company.
Okay. That's how I know a lot of abstract words, too. That's how I learned the word insomniac, I think, because I like the Ratchet and Clank games.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but so you're talking about the difference between dust being made into a human and the difference between a dead person being made into a human is whether or not there's an eidos of a human in there, right? This structural, functional relationship between all of the features and their actually relationship to one another, right? The relationship, it's like we don't even know all the features, way off from that. And beyond that, there's this infinite more amount of data that has to do with their relationship to each other and how they're sort of functioning together. Somehow, Christ puts that back into Lazarus.
Right.
Somehow, God puts that into dust. So, I mean, that's interesting. Trying to think about where I was going with that. But I mean... Yeah, I mean, but you're talking to that is the same sort of pattern, and like, again, I don't have a problem with that. I see Jesus speaking to Lazarus as sort of an affirmation of the power of, speaking truth to the world.
Yes, I guess the reason I bring that up is why believe the story about Jesus but have doubts about the story of Adam and Eve?
Because there's thousands of years in between the cultural evolution and how they would think about stories. It's like I don't think, like, I mean, even when approaching the Gospels and literature that ancient, I have that much less certainty about any of the events talked about there. I have certainty that these are important. I have a sort of a general certainty based on my relationship to my religion that, like, we as Christians believe this text is really important and we need to center our lives around it.
Right.
And that it's really true. And I don't necessarily mean true as in factual, but it aims true. It teaches us how to live our life in a true way. So it's like I lean more into the sort of didactic nature of the Bible as far as it teaches how.
Using these big words.
Sort of, I'm leaning into that. I believe the Bible is a book that teaches us how to live, not just facts about the universe. Like that.
Okay.
In some cases, that's sort of nice, but it's like I don't think God is. Even to sort of really put it from the Christian perspective, is like I don't think God would want to just give us a book for doing science when most of us aren't scientists, right? Like it's obviously not primarily a science book. That right. Seems to be something we should be able to agree on. And so I see the scientific philosophy as being somewhat young and somewhat recent. And so reading that into more and more ancient texts, and looking at Genesis as one of the most ancient ones, Job even more ancient, it seems strange to read that much of our current relationship and with sense making and with history and with facts back into such an ancient culture.
Okay. I was going to go someplace with this.
Okay, well, I'll keep going, and you can interrupt me when you've got something, because
I'll write it down.
There's a lot of there's a lot of other mythologies that are similarly old, and I don't think that. Well, I don't know how do you square that? It's like you look at the Egyptian mythology or the Mesopotamian mythology, and it's like they have very similar stories for the creation of the universe, or similarly mythic and epic, and it's like, how did they get to those? Why do they have these stories? Unless maybe you believe like a demon told them to write this story, or like it seems to me that a lot of people were sort of trying to grapple with. I mean, the way I think about it is that, okay, we have different cultures competing to survive at all, and the fact that they even become cultures as opposed to just small groups of people. It's like the only way to do that, only way to sort of surpass. There's something that another guy I was paying attention to introduced me to called the Dunbar limit, or the Dunbar number, which is basically like the number of relationships you can sort of actively keep up with in your life and like care about, right? There's a certain, it's kind of variable as to what that number is, but like, 50, 100, 250 bucks. But like you get past a certain number, maybe 200, and it's just like you can't, maybe some people can, but like in general, humans can't keep up with that many relationships, and you get a sort of chaotic society or chaotic group of relationships, and it falls apart. People end up hurting each other, or just they end up killing each other. They're not on the same page enough that they can't have a structure that stays together. It doesn't end up being a society. In order to get past that Dunbar limit, you need to have a story that sort of orients you together. You need to have a shared myth, right? If you have sort of a really compressed, patterned way of looking at the way your people look at the world and how you engage with the world, then you can sort of have more people on the same page because they know the same story. They've sung the same songs together. You have like a lot of really, really compressed, and again, whenever you compress a lot of information, you lose a lot of the detail. But you have a really general flow of like, at least we're all going this direction. We have these songs, and that's how sort of religion develops. And like, so it seems that, the same reason that Egypt was so successful and ended up being a group of people that ended up existing and thriving for so long is that they had stumbled on something probably deeply true in their myths. And that would be why I would even look at the similarities between, like, some people look at the similarities between different ancient mythologies and say, well, that's proof that Christianity is just made up and they were just copying off somebody else. It's like, okay, sure, maybe more or less. That doesn't discount the Christian myth. It actually to me, as a Christian, that all the more says, look at how incredible it is that these other people were sort of wrestling with reality and came to similar conclusions about the nature of existence and the nature of God and the nature of us in this world and in this universe.
Or they were reporting the same events, but the events are distorted.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see where you're going with this, and I'm not sure I agree with where you're going, but at least with that statement, I agree on. So you can take over here for a sec.
Well, that's the bottom line.
Okay.
If you've got different perspectives of the same event, why would I believe Russian news outlets report of one thing, the one event, and BBC reports on the same thing, but includes different details.
Right.
One doesn't discount the other, nor does it mean that BBC plagiarized abruptly or whatever.
So if they're trying to describe the same events, and we'd probably have to say that for a long time these stories would have been orally transferred because depending on how ancient.
But let's go with it. Sure.
Okay. So potentially these groups, because they lasted so long, like writing probably didn't get sort of discovered or invented or developed until a sufficiently advanced or sufficiently what would you say, like rigorous, I don't know, like a society that was pretty strong, could stand up and support itself and have time to spend doing other things than just looking for food. They had time to start to develop language, develop written language. That would have to come later than the original just organizational structure of the group.
But let's back up for a second.
Okay.
Is written superior to oral?
Not superior, but it's just more long-lasting and easier to sort of distribute in a streamlined.
Yes, or perhaps because people were more intelligent in the past, oral was just simply the preferred. But because intelligence was declining over time, oral traditions also start to decline in quality as well. So then they invent writing, basically.
Okay. I mean, that's an interesting take. It's thinking about things from, I don't know, the way that lands for me is more, I would think that writing, and initially you'd end up with just written numbers, because being able to sort of deal with data and you start to develop an economy, you want to be able to do that with a little bit more detail than just like, okay, this looks like roughly the same amount as that, because I don't know, it obviously there's utility in that. So I would see it initially it becomes useful for just like economy, and then later, what would come next? Why would you start writing down? I mean, you said maybe just people are just getting less intelligent. That seems, I don't know. Could you unpack like why would being written down be a sign of less intelligence?
Because it's trying to make up for so basically oral traditions, because people being more intelligent in the past, oral transmission was faster, it was easier, you could cover more ground in a shorter amount of time, it was more accurate. But if we start to decline in intelligence, and again, this is all wild speculation, but the reason I bring that up is because I want to point out there's a hidden assumption there that we were increasing in intelligence over time, whereas it may very well be backwards. Whereas writing was invented or developed to make up for the loss that was being experienced over time.
I think that might be kind of focusing. I think I actually sort of agree with that trajectory, and like you can even sort of see it now. It's like the more technology that you incorporate into a society, the less demand there is on each individual to be that intelligent or even that healthy. Right. It's like your technology covers all your bases. The more like your strongest technology covers for the weakest of anybody who, other than things that aren't covered sort of by your technology at the time. Because like now people are getting less and less, reliant on memorizing anything, because we've gone even past paper. We've gone to the internet. Right now we just look everything up. Right. So,
portable brain. Yes. Right.
So we've become deeply, what would you say when somebody's cyborgs basically?
Yes.
Yeah. Like So yeah, I see that. I see that, but I'm not sure that it would be so causal that like we're getting less intelligent, so we need technology, but almost more that it's a feedback loop that when we discover technology, it leads to us just less demand on general intelligence. So maybe I sort of agree with that, but so I mean, but there's an obvious utility to writing things down as well. But we're talking about myth and why people develop myth. Where was my original? I was making an argument about.
Yeah, and basically all I'm mentioning is there would be a train of events, basically. So oral traditions were originally very accurate, passed down generation to generation, but that started to decline. They began to be distorted more and more over time.
Yeah, I think I would say sure accurate, and I'm not like when I see this sort of like I think that there was sort of an evolution or a compression or a development of the stories we told about the universe and these, the oral tradition. And it's like what you get when you start to write things down is that you're not limited by the amount of time you have to sit down and sing the song or tell the story, right? Because if you want to sort of absolutely replicate an oral tradition, you have to memorize it, and that takes time. And even if you're particularly intelligent or you have a pretty good memory, it takes the amount of time to say the whole thing, right? So I mean, unless we want to say that like the entirety of Genesis through these numbers, I don't know, through Deuteronomy was like people just had that memorized and they kind of passed it down with word for word for generations. Is that kind of more or less where your intuition goes?
No, no, because I wouldn't even necessarily say that that's the case. I'm just simply trying to point out how you could turn it on its head, and argue that because that does have the subtle assumption.
But all I was trying to point to is that I think the oral tradition was first, and then writing was later.
Right, which may or may not be true, but sure.
No, that I think we have to agree there, like because it has to be true that writing happens later than we learn how to speak, because technology, like learning how to, like the technology of speech is more useful and costs less than the technology of writing things down. Right. You have to carry things around, right?
When you put it that way, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like we definitely start talking.
Adam and Eve talked first.
Right.
Wrote later.
Right.
So even I would agree with that.
Right. So I mean, we have a story about the universe first, and that's important. And crap, I don't know how deep we want to go on this, but let's hang out here for a few more minutes, anyways. So there has to be a story first, and that story has to be good enough that it sort of keeps you alive. It has to sort of not just ring true, but teach you true patterns about existence, teach you a true way of orienting your life enough that you end up becoming a sort of successful society and existing for a longer period than those who you're sort of competing with.
So why would you say that Genesis, for example, is not history?
I wouldn't say that it's not history. I would just say that it wasn't history. It doesn't seem likely to me that it was history recorded from a modern 20th century Western mindset.
No, that I would agree with.
Right. But it's like the many other similar kinds of traditions and stories about human history are sort of radically different, and the way that they're sort of interpreted is that they're extreme compressions of like very complicated and long-term patterns that they sort of noticed in their society that somehow gradually worked their ways into their stories. And like, I don't know how that process might have happened, especially if we're dealing with millions of years of oral tradition, or potentially, I don't know. Especially if we have that long, then we have a lot of room to sort of speculate about the development of these stories and how they develop. Because again, the more your story, and again, I'm using a different kind of way of talking about truth, but the more your story teaches you to live in a way that conforms to the demands of reality, or basically the more your story about reality teaches you how to be in right relationship with God, the more you're going to have a successful life and you're going to survive, I think. And so I think that like even the theory of evolution can sort of account for the development, the evolutionary development of stories that actually point to the way God works and the way he created.
Okay.
I don't know if that's kind of a weird.
let's take that and run with it for a second, because the theories of evolution have been around.
Or the camera turned off again. Evan, you want to hit that?
Theories of evolution were around at the time of Christ.
Yeah.
So, if we had evolved, for example, why would Christ point to Moses instead of saying, "Hey, go pay attention to what the Greeks said"? Because the Greeks are onto something. I mean, the Greeks had theories of evolution, of gradual formation. So why would Jesus, if he'd used evolution, or God had used evolution, why would Jesus not point to the Greeks and their theories of evolution, and instead he talked about Moses and the writings of Moses as historical and fact?
I mean, again, I don't think we have to assume that he's treating them as historical or fact, but at least that he's treating them as true, which again, I totally agree. And especially also, whenever you're talking to any particular community, I think you want to sort of choose the path of least resistance towards the most true thing you can say to those people. I don't want to kind of get, if you ask me about my day, and I know you're really just asking about, how I was feeling, if it was generally a good day, I can spend a long time kind of explaining what I mean by that I had a good day, or I can kind of get to the point and I can say I had a good day. And you might have slightly different presumptions about what I mean by that than what I'm communicating, but at least I know that pragmatically we're going to be on the same page enough when I say I had a good day, that's all I need to say. If Jesus is especially talking to Jews who are deeply familiar with these texts, I don't think the most relevant thing to point to would be material they're not familiar with. And I don't think, especially
unless
as far as
it was true.
Well, the thing is that there's plenty of true things.
If Moses was false, why point to it?
That's the thing is, I'm not saying that Moses was false, but it's like if the story of Moses communicated the point most succinctly and most truthfully that Jesus was trying to get at, and I think that's true. I think that the story of creation that we find in the Bible, there's a lot more truth in that story than there is in the story about evolution. Evolution helps us to do science, but it doesn't help us as much with the journey of trying to how to grapple with God and how to have a relationship with God. So I think that the Bible is more true than the theory of evolution.
I would disagree that evolution helps us with science, but frankly,
right. Well, assuming that it did, okay.
Evolution is frankly anti-science, because again, you come back to it. You mentioned the appendix, for instance. That was only one of 100 and some alleged vestigial organs that were alleged evolutionary leftovers.
Yeah,
they were discarded as useless leftovers, which is an evolutionary assumption. So that actually hindered scientific research, because people weren't going and looking to see what all these organs did.
Right. Which I mean, you say that's anti-scientific, and I agree with you to the extent that I think that the spirit of science and the way that science ought to be practiced conforms a little bit more to just something like Christian humility and like Christian community participation, like in a church, right? Like mutual trust and sharing of knowledge and being willing to be wrong and learn from one another. I think that that's how science sort of ought to be practiced. But to the extent that science tries to distance itself from those values, or specifically just from the really initially just the baggage of Christian terminology and theology, a lot of people, I mean, there's a problem there that we're having a difficult time within the Christian faith engaging our culture in a way that they find meaningful. And I think that that's a problem. And it seems that the hard argument between evolutionists and creationists might be somewhat a result of that, of people retreating from and trying to escape from a conversation that we're not sort of having very well. And so I kind of understand that. And so I don't, like, I mean, you kind of sum it up as just people not willing to kind of come to terms with their sin. I think that's sort of loosely true, but I guess I just have a little bit more compassion for that perspective as well, because it seems like there is a genuinely difficult and frustrating and probably not being handled very well conversation that I can see why people would want to run away from. And so that sort of makes sense to me. Sorry, I know that's sort of a tangent, but I want to make sure to touch on that because I don't know how your perspective in general is of the sort of scientific community. I mean, you made a pretty sweeping statement that evolution is anti-science.
Yes.
And I think that people who are practicing math, people who are practicing any academic discipline are at times and in a lot of ways anti whatever that discipline is, because the way that you practice any of those disciplines properly would look a lot more like the way that, Christian values, I think, would ultimately teach you to practice it.
Say that again?
I guess I'm just saying that, like, any academic discipline is anti what it's sort of supposed to be, to the extent that it's not being practiced in a more or less Christian way. And so, like, there's a separation between Christianity and science right now, for reasons that is another long conversation. But so science is trying to get by being anti-Christianity to some extent. So it's anti itself to the extent that it's anti-Christianity.
I guess the problem there being the limits of science, which are philosophical, of course.
Okay.
But science is restricted to the natural realm. So the moment you get into discussions of God or creation, and in some ways even evolution, you start getting beyond that realm of the natural. Law of biogenesis. To come up with the first life, you have to violate the law, a well-established scientific and natural law of biogenesis. So that means it's neither natural nor scientific. It is, by definition, a supernatural process. So it's outside the realm of science. It's a miracle.
It's outside the way I think about that, because we have to kind of deal with that every time we're talking about a baby being born. Like, consciousness somehow just ends up there in what was previously just cells, or previously just an egg and a sperm. Right? Like, unless you think that all the eggs and all the sperms are conscious, or like half conscious, and then they get full conscious. Right. That's a strange argument, and I don't think that the facts are in about that. I don't think we have a strong, and I don't think anybody can really, really confidently say this is when consciousness begins to exist, or this even is what consciousness is. That's a huge debate, and nobody can really. We haven't landed on that. Oh, geez, where was I going?
I don't know.
Got to think of a nice way to wrap it all up cleanly.
I guess are we getting kind of late here?
I'm getting hungry, so
okay. I will try not to go too much. I mean, there's a lot here and a lot of avenues we can go down. So where does consciousness come from? We don't know. So we're talking about biogenesis.
But even consciousness is outside of the natural realm, or outside of the scientific realm.
Right. Okay. So what I was going to say is, as far as the scientific realm, it's like, okay, that word of scientific realm doesn't quite. I mean, so you see that there's sort of a hard divide between the natural and supernatural, because I mean.
Yep.
I guess that's not where my sort of intuition goes, I guess. I don't see the, and I mean, you can get into, Lewis has written a whole bunch about, like, on miracles, about whether or not, miracles are something that sort of break the laws of nature. He doesn't view it that way. He views it as just sort of like things outside of our understanding of the way that the world and the universe works.
Yes, but it would be outside of the laws of nature.
Well, I mean,
raising the dead, for example.
Well, I mean, raising the dead or life coming from something that's not alive happens every time a baby is conceived, right?
Except it's coming from life.
Well, sort of. I mean, if you had just like when you have,
put it to you this way: it didn't come from a rock.
Okay.
So the law of biogenesis.
What's the difference then between life and
because
non-life?
Life only comes from life.
No, I know. Okay, but so what? How do you define something as being alive?
Yeah, well, that's another one.
Yeah. Right. I know. So, I mean, we should more or less recognize that as sort of a mystery too, and it's difficult to define these things. It's just a strange border.
Yes.
And so you say, like, the law of biogenesis. You brought that up a couple times. Is that something that we can look at? And what is that? What's the law of biogenesis?
Yeah, that was basically Louis Pasteur that came up with that, and it's basically when, very simply put, we only see life coming from life. There has never been an exception. That's why it's a law. There's actually very few scientific and natural laws per se. but that's one of them. And it's because it's always been observed that way. We have never observed life coming from, say, a rock, something non-living. Anything we did would be outside of that law. It's basically what I'm getting at. And even the evolutionists would agree on that.
I mean, they wouldn't agree that it would be a law that it can't come from non-life. Like, obviously...
Actually, they do.
I mean, I know Dawkins doesn't think of it that way. And when I read The Selfish Gene, he talks about biogenesis. He talks about how it might have happened.
They talk about it. They talk about how it might have happened, but it's never been observed. And there's good reasons for it.
But the point within the theory is not that it's been observed. It's just that that there's not a law against it being possible.
Except it is a law.
Okay, but
Dawkins even knows it.
Okay, but
basically,
the way laws work in science isn't the way that they work in. Well, I mean, I guess it is more or less.
It isn't the way it works in his imagination.
No, I was going to say, isn't the way they work in society or like legal systems. But in some sense, it is. It's just like if somebody violates it, they're in trouble. But not. They're not laws. I mean, as far as like Newton's law of gravity, he didn't describe gravity very well. He did it to the best of. He did it pretty well, and it became useful for a lot of things. And then we realized when we start talking about celestial objects, his laws of gravity don't work anymore. And then we get Einsteinian relativity.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure there's laws of gravity.
Right. Well, I mean,
Einstein relativity is definitely not a law.
Right. I mean, that got us a lot further, though. It became almost law-like, and then now we're beyond that. We don't know what to do because there's things
they're
about
not laws. That's my point.
Well, I mean,
there's very few scientific and natural laws. The law of biogenesis is one of them.
Okay,
There's never been an exception observed. And there's actually millions of reasons why we'll never see an exception observed.
I mean, that's sort of a, I don't know, you could say that, but like, that doesn't sound like...
That's the facts.
Well, it's a fact, again, it's a fact that it hasn't been observed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But, I mean, I didn't observe you getting here. Like, anytime we try to, like, think about truth, we're always doing a lot of inferring.
Yes.
So, I mean, as somebody who finds the story of evolution compelling, I don't look and think about when I think about abiogenesis. I don't know what you said, biogenesis.
Biogenesis, abiogenesis,
okay.
Same thing, basically.
Okay. I don't think that you have to observe that for it to be the most compelling story that we sort of have about. Well, I mean, it's just like it's one story we can infer about potentially where we came from, as opposed to we were poofed into existence by God speaking.
Both are outside of the natural realm.
Right. Well, yeah, both of them are beyond our current understanding of science, and I guess that's what kind of where we were talking about natural and supernatural realm. Whereas, like,
yes,
when I think about natural versus supernatural, it doesn't have to do with there being different laws. It's just that any of our current sort of scientific laws have to do with our best modeling of the universe that we can do so far. But like, it's always a so far, and hopefully to be disproved someday when we get better at it.
Right. Except the laws are in a different category all in themselves. So all I'm saying is that the first life had to have come from life. That's all I'm saying. Now, in my case, what I think is that first life was outside of the natural realm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm interested even in this philosophical thinkers now who are wondering whether or not everything is alive.
Right.
Which, so I mean,
right.
that becomes less or more of a problem depending on where you're looking at it, because I don't know that there's a fundamental difference between. I mean, this is obviously where the problem gets very fuzzy and difficult to follow, because, okay, what's life? What's consciousness? We don't know exactly. It's difficult to explain. So,
except the reason I bring that up is I'm playing by the evolutionist rules.
Okay.
If it can only be natural processes.
I mean, from my perspective, as not an evolutionist, because I'm not doing evolutionary scientist, but somebody who believes in evolution or believes that evolution. I don't know the best way to say that. I don't think that you have to. I don't think you have to demonstrate it for it to be a compelling story. It just has to be, okay, we're going to keep trying. I mean, whenever you talk about laws, it's just, I don't think that they have to be laws as far as being unbreakable. If you're talking to me as opposed to just the evolutionists who are playing by their own rules, I think that any law or any statement, scientific fact, is a fact until later proven in more detail and potentially refuted by the more details that we sort of observe as we keep on digging.
Yes. And in the meantime, there is literally millions of reasons why that has never been observed to be violated and why it won't be. Just the proteins in your body. They can't, everything in nature works to break them apart, not build them up. The DNA in your body, everything in nature works to break them apart. Not to mention, where did the code come from? If you write out letters on a screen, that is gibberish unless an intelligence imposes order in that.
Okay.
So, I mean, all of those things, there's literally millions of reasons why biogenesis has never been observed to be nothing. It's never been observed to be refuted, or it hasn't been observed to have happened, and it won't be.
Okay.
Is what
I said I would pay attention to our energy levels, about how long we could go in. I think we're probably reaching the end here.
I'm way past the end already.
I want to, if we can tread it lightly, I want to maybe talk about one last thing for a few minutes. And I'm not going to ask you about aliens because I know that could be another 3-hour conversation. But, okay, as far as, so you made the statement about things ultimately going towards destruction, talking about like thermodynamics or just like things breaking apart.
Yep.
I don't argue that is a feature of existence and of reality and the way systems work. But I don't think that just because that directionality is in there, like the directionality to fall apart, means ultimately everything is heading towards destruction and falling apart. I don't think we're ultimately headed toward entropy just because entropy is a feature of working systems. Is entropy not a good word to use here?
That's possibly. Basically, entropy is another one of the very few scientific laws. And it's an absolute in the scientific community.
Right.
So that's not a maybe. I mean, some have even written, if you disagree with entropy, there's no hope.
No, I'm not saying that I disagree with entropy. I'm saying that I disagree that the fact that entropy is true means that it's true. I mean, that's such a weird statement to make about. But like the fact that basically, just to more simply, rather than getting into too much jargon, that things break down.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking down is a fundamental feature of growing stronger and becoming and growth. Like when it's a fundamental feature of evolutionary theory too. It's just like it's mutation. Like if things break down and then they fall into a new way of being, like then there's a possibility that they get better. And if they get better, even if usually they get worse, the better ones survive and the worse ones die off. And I think you see that, like evolutionary theory, the reason that I found it so interesting when I first heard it talked about in detail is because it seemed to make sense of so many other aspects of my life beyond, like especially the final chapter of The Selfish Gene where he talks about memes, right? He applies evolutionary theory to ideas, and I was like, this is one of the most useful ways I've been able to think about thinking. Like this is such an interesting and compelling story, and it's so useful for analyzing the way I work and the way communities work, right? Ideas do break down, but ultimately, to the extent that we see cultures progressing, to the extent that we see families progressing, to the extent that that I hope that my children will be more mature and more wise than I am, and that my ceiling will be their floor. That would be a result of sort of mimetic evolution, like my ideas breaking down and sort of whatever was good about them sticking.
Except again, while that's not what we see, let's take that and run with it. As you mentioned, which is correct. If you could, let's talk genetics, just because that kind of brings the concept home. Mm-hmm. There are mutations, and the vast majority of them are detrimental. They're not good for you.
Right.
Or the vast majority are neutral. It has
right. Yeah,
no benefit or detriment.
And then some of them are totally detrimental.
Quite a few detrimental. Some might argue you might get 1 in 100 that's positive. Mm-hmm. So let's say you pass that on.
Yeah.
So you've
1 in 100 might even be too high.
Yeah, because there's some who have argued with a lot of compelling evidence that there are no positive mutations. But let's give it for a second.
Okay.
Let's just say, 1 in 100. You pass all that on to your children. Well, you've passed on one good gene and at least dozens of detrimental genes.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next generation, they pass on a good gene, and plus the one you pass to them. So now they got two good mutations. Now they've got dozens and dozens of detrimental ones.
Well, but they don't stack up. You're still running with sort of a limited hard drive, to use this sort of a computer analogy. But it's like, okay, let's say you have 10 gigs of data and 100 meg is useful stuff that you're actually running that's keeping you alive. And then you have, well, if I said you have 10 gigabytes, then that means you've got 9 gigabytes and 900 meg to kind of experiment with.
Except that's not what the science shows.
Okay.
That's what I'm getting at is if you want to pass on those single beneficial mutations, you also have to pass on dozens of detrimental ones. And that's ignoring all the neutral ones. And those do collect over time. And that's the issue is even giving arguably a fictitious scenario of beneficial mutations being passed on.
Well, okay, but this sounds like you're just saying that in general, evolution as a story, as a directionality, is not possible and not accurate. But I thought that you kind of didn't. That wasn't part of your perspective.
Well, let's come back to that term evolution, because perhaps I should have clarified this at the beginning, because evolution in its simplest form is happening. Evolution is just simply change over time.
Right.
So
but it's not changed to sort of meet an environment and be more in a sort of better relationship with it. You don't see that?
No. That's
okay. So you don't see positive evolution as being possible.
Right. And that is the evolution that is taught. Positive upwards gaining.
Can you,
evolution.
Evan, on my notes there, I think I have I had some notes I wanted to talk about with Ian. Click Ian Juby right there. Scroll down. A little lower. Okay. No, I was hoping I had a picture there, but I don't have it. I talked to another kind of new friend of mine a couple weeks ago who is a Christian evolutionary teacher. She teaches evolution science to evangelical Christians. And in one of her talks, she was just kind of showing off an experiment that basically just shows that evolution is possible and happens. I mean, I referenced this earlier, that they basically have a vat of... I can explain the experiment pretty well, even if we don't. Maybe you can find it, but if you can't, it's not that hard to follow.
I know. I already know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, so they have different, 10 different levels of increasing sort of volume, or not volume, increasing. There's a poison and it's diluted as you get further out away from the pool. There's different pools and different entrances. Right?
Yes.
So you get to the end, and it's just basically water, and the organism is.
That might be different. I was thinking the bacterial mutations for digesting nylon, for instance. Nylonase is a common one.
Okay, well, this one anyways, let me see if I can just run through it. So there's 10 chambers, and each chamber, as you go deeper, has a higher percentage of this poison, and you get to the outside and there's no poison. Right. So they introduce a bacteria, or I don't know, small organism that can reproduce really quickly. Yeah, so some sort of bacteria, and it's not a bacteria that can it's not sand, it's water, or some sort of anyway. This bacteria is not immune to the poison.
Right.
It will die if it's exposed to the poison.
Yep.
Basically they just introduce it to the outermost chamber.
Yep.
And they have little small gates in between each chamber. Mm-hmm. And so you can really easily just see where the bacteria that had a mutation that was able to stand a little bit of the poison got through. And then you can see the branching because they can actually just see where they spread out. It'd be great to be able to see this because it's a very visual thing to kind of look at. But basically, you can see that by the end, there is a subpopulation. It's great grandchildren in that process that end up being basically totally immune to the poison.
Yeah,
whereas all the
and
rest of them are not.
It's the exact same argument with nylon A's, citron A's. It's the exact same thing.
Okay.
So basically, and technically, again, here we go with the terminologies again. Technically, it is a mutation. A mutation, again, is just a change in the genetics. Okay.
Right.
So unfortunately, they're catchwords: evolution and mutation.
Okay.
So it is a mutation, and it does have a benefit. It allows the organism to survive. It does that by sacrificing other systems, usually reproduction, but not always. And there was actually a specific terminology for it. I've forgotten the term right now. But basically, it's there's several points to be made there. Number one, this is bacteria, not humans. Okay, so bacteria can exchange DNA. Just
Evan,
by
you could
touching
just
each other.
Evan, if you want to just YouTube April Cordero, and you can find one of her. It's in one of her presentations on YouTube. You can find this picture. But sorry, I'm interrupting you. I mean, it sounds like you understand the what's being referenced, anyways.
Yeah, it's the base thing. Basically, it's all the same principle anyway. Bacteria can exchange DNA by immediately touching each other.
It's one up there. No.
This one? Yeah.
It's later on in there, but might not be in this. Oh, here it is. This is great. So this shows the center chamber has the most of the poison, and you can just play it if you want, or you can just kind of play it on fast speed. But there's a really interesting visual that you see. But so is your argument just that the sort of the genetic information for being immune to that poison sort of existed in the creature originally, and it just kind of came to the forefront?
It actually it actually rearranged its own DNA.
Right, so it didn't get new DNA, and it just had DNA that was already in there, but that wasn't sort of active?
Right, it borrowed it. It
borrowed it, okay.
Programmers call it metaprogramming. So basically the program reprograms itself. So bacteria have this ability, okay? So they can reprogram their own DNA. They do it for survivability. If you take those bacteria and now put them in normal conditions, they will revert back to exactly the way they were before.
Right, over several generations?
No, almost immediately. Yeah, it usually it happens usually within one generation. It has to, because otherwise, if it kills them all off, then you've got no reproduction. So it has to be pretty much within one generation.
That doesn't make sense, because if they're able to reproduce in the state where they've kind of put that information on the forefront, where they can be. I mean, you just saw this visual where like there's a whole bunch of generations after they get introduced to the poison, like they're alive and they're reproducing in that environment. And you put them in another environment, they just stop doing that.
No, they're so basically their DNA reverts back to what it was before. The beneficial mutation that allowed them to survive the poison, it just goes away. So for example, usually it's taken, they sacrifice reproductive, not ability, but efficiency. They sacrifice that. So their reproduction rate goes way down. And it's not always reproduction. Sometimes it's other systems. They take from that to build a survivability ability. And secondly, this is bacteria. It has nothing to do with multicelled organisms. So if this happened, say, for example, in a human, then you have one specific cell which can survive a poison and others can't. So it flourishes and grows, whereas the other cells die off. We call that cancer. So it doesn't apply to multicellular organisms either. So I know what they're saying, but there's huge problems with this and trying to apply it to evolutionary.
Don't you see that with
function?
Like different humans in the world developing defense against diseases specific to those areas?
What are you saying, Evan?
Like people in Africa are able to handle certain diseases there because they're familiarized with the bacteria over their life, and then you have someone come in from North America.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it'd have to be. You'd have to bring up specific You have to bring up specifics on that one because it'd have to address each one. There was a well-known atheist YouTuber, Aaron Raw, did a video on this years ago and actually made a response. His video was pretty short, like 10 minutes, and he was talking about beneficial mutations. And first of all, he had, like, out of all the examples, I think there was only 3 that were arguably beneficial mutations. And then, I mean, it took me a full half hour just to deal with it because it was so, first of all, his claims were just plain wrong on many of them. And secondly, it was detrimental mutations. For example, one mutation allowed this child to grow incredible muscles, but it's also horribly detrimental, and they typically die at a very young age because of this. They're muscle bound, basically. There's actually, they call that a beneficial mutation in cattle because they get more meat off the cattle. But you're ignoring all the detrimental.
Right. In order for it to be actually a positive mutation, it has to meet its environment and it has to last for a long time and continue to exist as well.
Yes.
So, I mean, and it's difficult to do that on any sort of observe that on any multi-cell organism because generations take a pretty long time. Yes. Although, I mean, probably with bugs, you could probably do some better studies. It would be great if we had the energy and the time to continue to have a super technical discussion about this and try to follow this conversation to the end. I mean, there's no end to this conversation. We're not going to solve this divide, but
come on, man.
I'll leave the ball in your court to kind of sum up with I have maybe one final sort of question for you. Where do you see, or how do you think, especially within Christian circles, we're going to move towards a healthier conversation about this, even within like conversations between me and you, who are obviously we both share the same faith and have been able to have a to some extent it seems like we had a pretty good conversation here. What do you think, even to the extent of using this conversation as an example, what's working here that's not working in so many other cases?
Again, I come back to Christ. He wasn't exactly how can I put this? I mean, he ticked off awful lot of people to the point where they killed him. I mean, he really, really angered them. So I'm not, and he did say, I don't come to bring peace. I come to bring a sword. He said it.
Right.
So it's, I don't think you're going to be able to, because the bottom line is, even Christ himself said, he's not coming to bring peace. He's coming to bring division. And he will cause division. And he is even today. Anyway,
so okay.
So there's no hope. No hope. It's hopeless.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty negative note to end on, but I mean, I really appreciate you taking several hours to sit down and chat with me and share your perspective on this.
I'll get a nap next time first.
Get it. Sounds good. Thanks again, man.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to share it with a friend. Or, even better, take whatever you found interesting here and go and have a real face-to-face conversation with somebody that you care about, or somebody that you don't understand very well. I think face-to-face conversation is one of the most important tools that we have for building and maintaining real relationships and real communities. Many institutions in our lives have an incentive to crowd out these longer, more engaging interactions with short-form junk food content. I get it. They're just trying to make money. The point of this project for me is to spend some time pushing back against some of those forces in my life. I want to practice listening to and engaging with people that I don't necessarily understand very well. I also want to spend some time listening to and learning from some people who seem to have a good track record of listening to and engaging with people that they disagree with. If you're interested in working on some of this stuff too, feel free to keep up with this project by subscribing and pressing the little bell thingy that lets YouTube know that you want to keep seeing these videos. I really think that if we can get better at conversation, we might actually change the world. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.